What's going on, guys? This is Junior, and today I'm going to show you how to build a full stack microservice architecture application using Spring Boot, Spring Security with OAuth 2 in the backend, and the latest version of Angular in the front end. The first thing I'm going to show you is a demo of the application we will be building in this course. First, we'll look at all the features when users are not logged in, and second, we'll look at all the features of the application when users are logged in. So let's look at what you can do in the application when you're not logged in. There are 4 pages you can access when you're not logged in: the home page, which is the page I'm on right now; the login page, where users can log in; the register page to register a user of the application; and the reset password page so that you can reset your password. Now let's go to the register page. On this page, you can create a new account. So let's go ahead and register a new user. John Doe. And there's validation on this form. So if I remove the text and then remove the focus, it will give us a visual indication that the form is invalid. The same goes for every input in the form. We also have email validation. So this is the email that I'm going to use. But if I remove the @, for example, and then I remove the focus, it tells me that the email is not valid. And if I remove the whole thing altogether, then it tells me that the email is required. So I'm going to paste that back in and pass in the @. The button to submit the form is also disabled if the form is not valid. So you can see at this point, the form is not valid because I haven't provided a username and a password. So let's go ahead and make our form valid and then submit it. I'm gonna pass in the last name. Oh, and before we submit, I'm gonna copy this. So if I use an existing email, like an email that's already associated with a user, and I try to create the account, it tells me that the email is already in use. So let's pass in this test email that I created, then click on create account, and you can see that my account has been created. The registration is successful and I got an email to verify my new account. If I go to login and try to access the application, I will get an error because even though I do have an account, I can't log in because my account is not enabled yet. So let's go to my email, and you can see this is the new email that I got. I'm gonna go ahead and open it. So until I click this link to verify my account, I won't be able to log in. And if you want to see that, I can just copy this email here and I can try to log in. And I'm going to say this is the password. And you can see it says account is currently locked. Let's go to my email and let's go ahead and click on this link. And account verified. I'm going to go back to the login page and try to log in now. Gonna pass in that email again, and then I'm gonna say this is the password, and I'm gonna click sign into my account, and you can see I was able to log in successfully. So before we explore the application, let's go back and check out the reset password. So I'm gonna go ahead and log out and terminate my session. Now let's go to the reset password page, and I'm gonna reset my password. I need to give my email, and I'm gonna enter like some bad email and then press reset password, and it didn't find a user by this email. So let me enter the correct email and click reset password, and you can see that it was successful. Again, I need to go to my email to access the link to change my password. So let's go back to the email, and I'm gonna go back. You can see I got another email. I'm gonna go ahead and open it, and once again, I need to click on this link, and the link has been verified. Now I can enter my new password. So I'm gonna enter my new password, and I'm gonna make the password not match, and I press update password, and you can see it tells me that the passwords don't match. Go ahead and enter the correct password and press update password, and you can see now my password has been updated. Now I'm gonna go back to the login and try to log in with my new password and sign into my account. And again, you can see that it's been successful using the new password. So we've explored all the pages you can access in the application when you're not logged in. Now we're going to look at the application for a logged in user. I'm going to use a regular user first, and then I will use an admin user so that you can see the difference. And since this is a new user and doesn't have any tickets, I'm going to use a different user that has more data. So I'm going to go ahead and log out, terminate my session. I'm going to go and log in with this user. And then I'm gonna pass in the password and then press enter. And now I'm logged in as Giselle. So this is the regular user that I'm going to be using to show you what a regular user can do. And then I will switch to using an admin user. So this is the dashboard. That's the page that you're landed on when you log into the application. The dashboard page of the application provides an overview of key information and actionable items for users. Here we have a summary of ticket metrics. We have a breakdown of tickets by their current status, for example, in progress, in review, and completed, and the ticket by their type. So in this case, we have 4 incidents and 1 defect. Now I'm gonna scroll down a little bit, and here we have a line graph. And this graph is showing the number of tickets trend over time. In this case, it's tracking changes of ticket number per week. A rising line indicates a growth or an increase, and a declining line shows a decrease in the number of tickets for that week. And because she really has just 5 tickets, so you don't see that this is a very interesting graph. But when I log in as an admin, you will see how different and interesting this is gonna look. And down there, we have another bar chart showing tickets by their status. So in progress, in review, completed, new. And on the right, we're tracking the oldest open tickets. So this is gonna allow us to address long-standing issues that might impact customers and projects or service level agreement. And addressing them can improve customer satisfaction and compliance. And I can also click on the ticket from here to go to the ticket detail page, but we're not gonna go ahead and explore this page yet. So let's go ahead and go back. And I think that's everything I have for the dashboard. The next page we're going to be looking at is the profile page. So let's go ahead and click on the profile. On the profile page, you can see your personal information. I can, for example, update my picture. And you can see the picture has been updated. I'm going to put Giselle back. I can update my profile information. I'm also going to change our email because I'm going to be using this test email. So let's grab this email again and paste it here. I removed that email to the user that we just created because I need to use that email so that I can show you that she will be getting emails depending on what's going on their tickets and stuff like that. So let's go ahead and update her information. Okay, so she's good. I can scroll down and I can update my password as well. So I'll give the current password, and then I'm gonna pass in some bad passwords here, and then I'm gonna click update. You can see it tells me password don't match. So if I make the new password match, but I pass in a bad current password and I try to update, and it tells me the existing password is incorrect. So let's pass in the correct password, the new password, and then I'm gonna click update password. And you can see password updated successfully. So if I want to, I can update my password in my profile. I can also change my account settings. However, because I'm not an admin, I don't have permission to do that. So if I click to lock my account, and it tells me that you don't have permission to change account settings, and that's true for everything here. But I'll show you when we're an admin, you'll be able to change this information. And then I'm gonna scroll down some more. I can also enable and disable two-factor authentication. So I can enable it, I can disable it. So let me go ahead and enable it. I'm gonna use my phone and the Google Authenticator app to scan this QR code. So I'm gonna open the app and I'm gonna click on this plus sign, and then I'm gonna say scan QR code, and then I'm gonna go ahead and scan it, and you can see it pops up on my screen at the very bottom. So this is gonna be the code that we're gonna need to provide when we go to login. So let's go ahead and test this out. So I'm gonna scroll up, copy this email address. I'm gonna click on log out, terminate my session, go back to login, paste this email, pass in the new password. And you can see now I am presented with this form to enter the QR code. So if I enter some bad QR code, verify, and then I'm gonna enter what you can see on my phone, so 755602, and then I'm gonna say verify QR code, and you can see it's authenticating me again, and then now I'm back to login. So this is the two-factor authentication. Let's go to my profile again, and I'm gonna go ahead and scroll down. I can manage my access down here, so my role and permission, and because I'm just a simple user, as you can see here, I'm not allowed to update my role and my permissions. And then lastly, at the very bottom, you have a list of all the devices that you've used to log in with the IP address and the time that you logged in. And I'm also showing that same information on the side here, so you don't have to scroll all the way to the bottom to be able to see the most recent devices. In this case, I'm showing the top 3. And the IP addresses, they're local, so I got 0000, or in your case, it could be like 127.0.0 and then 1, as you can see here when I log in with Firefox. But whenever this application is deployed in the real world, then these will look like real IP addresses, and you'll be able to use other tools to determine the location and stuff like that. So if you want to enhance this feature and show the location, it should be pretty easy for you to do that. So I'm going to scroll to the top. I think that's everything that you can do on the profile page. There's more like little thing, like for example, all of these fields have validation. So if you don't provide the correct information, you won't be able to update your profile and little things like that. But those are the main things that you can actually do when you are logged in and you access the profile page. So now we're going to go ahead and look at the tickets page. So I'm going to click on the tickets. So on the tickets page is where I can see a list of all the tickets and some information about them. So for example, the title, the ticket number, the description, the status of the ticket, in this case it's in progress, the type of the ticket, so this is an incident, this is a defect, the number of attachments or files that the ticket has, and the progress of the ticket, which I'm showing here, and it's 23% for this one, and also the date that the ticket was created. I can also filter the tickets by their current status. In this case, if I select in progress, you'll see that only this one is displayed. What else did we have? We have review and completed. So let's do and review. And if we do completed, I can also select multiple filters all at once. So if I go back to all, let's say she has 3 incidents. So I'm gonna say incident, and let's say I wanted to have the complete. So I'm gonna say completed. As you can see, this one is filtered. She had in review. This one is filtered, and I can also search. So let me select all. And for example, if I start typing printer, you can see this one is here. Let's do just P. Let's do PR. So if I do PR, I have 2 of them. So let's say I wanted all the completed, so I can select completed. Only this one is here, and I can mix and match is what I'm trying to show you. So if I say incident, this one will stay here, but if I select a different type, it'll be gone. It'll say no tickets found because they all work together. So let's go ahead and remove those filters. And I'm gonna go ahead and create a new ticket. So let's say I'm not able to access my profile, for example. I'm gonna pass in some dummy text in here. I'm gonna select the type. Let's say it's an incident, and I'm gonna say medium. I'm gonna add some files. Open. I can delete some files if I want. Delete another one, and then I'm gonna say create ticket, and you can see the ticket was created here. And I can go to the detail. You can see everything is here. I get the files that I added, and by default the ticket status is new, and here's all the information here. One other thing is I get an email whenever I create a new ticket. So if I go back to the email and go back, you can see new support ticket, and if I open this, it just shows me information about the ticket that I just created. Tells me that support will take a look at it as soon as possible, and it shows me some of the information of the ticket. So the ticket number, the subject or the title, and the priority of the ticket. And I can also click to view the ticket. So if I click on this button, it will take me to the ticket detail page. So if I click it, you can see I am in the same page that I was here. So I'm gonna go back here and delete. And if I refresh this, by the way, since I'm already logged in, it will take me back to the home page. So it takes me to the dashboard. So let's go back to the tickets, and let's go ahead and click on one of these tickets so that we can see the ticket details page. So I'm gonna go ahead and click on this one, and the ticket detail page is where you can see all the details about the ticket. I can update the ticket, so I can change the text here if I want. I can change the type. Let's say this is a design, change the priority, and I can change the percentage. Say it's in progress. I can change the due date if I want to. And then I'm gonna click update ticket, and you can see the information is reflected immediately. The ticket is currently not assigned, and because I'm not an admin, I can't assign a tech support representative to the ticket, but I will show you that we will be able to do this once I log in as an admin. But in this case, since this user is a simple user, then the drop down is disabled. You can see I'm clicking it, nothing is happening. I can also upload attachments to the ticket. Say I wanted to show the error with a screenshot or something, then I can attach the screenshot here. So let me upload another file. I'm gonna select this diagram and you can see the file is uploaded here. I can also download or remove a file. So let's download this diagram again. You can see it's here. I can download it and click open. And I can also delete it. So if I click, for example, to delete, I can delete this video. I can click outside, or I can click cancel, or I can just say, yes, I'm sure. And then this file is deleted. The tickets also have tasks. And currently this ticket has one task that was created by myself. So Junior right here, I'm an admin. But Giselle, or this user, cannot create a new task. You can see there's no option to create a new task because she's not an admin or a tech support. So she cannot add a new task. And I can also add a comment to the ticket. So I'm gonna say tried and it did not work. Please help. And then I'm gonna say post. You can see the new comment has been added. And this communication happens between an admin and a tech support and the owner of the ticket. So in this case, Giselle is the owner of this ticket, and you can see the communication between me and her. So I'm logged in as her right now, but I'm an admin and I'm the one who's been assisting her with this issue. The other thing I want to show you with the comment is I can also edit this comment or delete it. And I'm gonna say, please help me, for example, something real simple. And then I'm gonna say save. Now you can see that it says edited. I can also delete the comment. I get a validation pop up. I can say cancel. I'm gonna copy this because I don't want to type it in again, because I'm gonna recommit this again, and I'm gonna delete it. And I'm gonna say yes, I'm sure. You can see the comment has been deleted. So let me put that comment back in. So I think that's everything that a regular user can do in the ticket detail page. Now let's go to the report. The report page is where you can generate and download ticket reports. At the top, we can select the filters we want to filter the tickets by. So I can filter by title, I can filter by status, I can filter by type. So let me enter some details here. Well, if I don't select any filter at all, and I search, I should be able to get everything. And I think she has 6 tickets. So you can see I get all 6 of them. And I can search. So let's say missing and press search. You can see only this one with the word missing is listed here. I can remove this and I can select the from and to date that the ticket was created. So let me select, I think I created these tickets back in 2024. Let's say today. Yeah, I'll get everything. Let's say December 12th. Okay. July to September. No, nothing. Cool. So if the ticket were not created between this timestamp, then they won't be showing up here. So if I remove them, I search again, then I get everything. And I can filter by, let's say, incident, because I know she has incidents. So search, you can see only the incidents are here. And if I say I want the medium priority, so I should only get these 3 actually. So let's select and search. You can see I get these 3. So once I have the result of the search that I want, then I can go ahead and download the report. I'm gonna remove the filters, select everything, and then I can click download report. And the name of the report is just the current date and time. And I'm gonna say save, and then I'm gonna click to open the report. And you can see the report is here. We have the logo and the name, CAT support, at the very top. And then we have the person who generated the report. In this case, it's Giselle. The date the report was generated, and the total number of tickets in the report. And then here we have the actual tickets. And this is not looking like much, but when we have more tickets and we have pagination, as you can see here, we have pagination, it's gonna look a lot more serious and important. And when I log in as an admin, I will show you some of these things. So let's go back and close this. Now let's look at the message So let's go to message. She has 0 unread messages. She has 1 conversation, which is with me. You can see my picture here. I'm an admin. So the message page is where you can send a message and see the conversations you have with the support team or the administration or the management. I currently have 1 conversation, but no unread messages. I can send a new message. So if I click new message, I can either send the message to the ticket support. So if I have an issue with the ticket, if I have an issue with the administration or something, then I can send the message to administration. Or if I have some issue, let's say with HR or something like that, then I can send to management. In this case, all of these 3 will go to me because, you know, this is a demo, but in your case, you will have a different email address for each one of these. And I'll show you where to set this up. So in my case, I'm just going to select ticket support. Whatever I select here, it will still go to me. So I'll select support. Remember, she already has a support conversation up here. And then I'm going to say, hey, just checking on our last conversation. Do you have any updates? Thank you. And then I'm gonna go ahead and send it. And you can see the message is here because we already have an existing conversation with support. Since I already have an existing conversation with support, you can see that the latest message was added to my current conversation with support. So let's go ahead and open this conversation, and you see the messages between me and support, or Junior and Giselle, because if I say me, I might confuse you with me as the logged in user or me as the admin here. But that's just the conversation between support and Giselle. But in this case, I represent support, and I'm gonna log in as an admin because Giselle is just a regular user. So that's about everything I wanted to show you that a user can do in the application. Now I'm gonna go ahead and log in as an admin and show you what an admin user can do in the application. So I'm gonna go ahead and log out and terminate my session, and I'm gonna log in with myself and then press sign in. And this is gonna be me. Okay, so I'm logged in as an admin, and you can see this is looking more normal because we have a lot of data. So the line graph looks more normal, and then these look more like they mean something. So now I'm logged in as an admin, and the dashboard, all the functionalities are the same except that I can see everyone's ticket. So me myself, I don't really have any tickets. So the tickets that I'm seeing here as an admin are everybody else's ticket. In this case, in total, we have 74 tickets, 9 completed, 22 in progress, 6 impeded, and I can see the breakdown by the status, the type, and the trend for every week, and I can see the oldest open tickets. I'm gonna scroll up. Now let's go to the tickets page. You can see now I have pagination because there is more than 12 tickets, and the pagination is dissected by 12. So every time we have 12, we're gonna consider it as a page. So I can go to the different pages because I have so many of them, because that's everybody's tickets. I can go back to page 1. So that's pagination, which you didn't get to see when we were logged in as Giselle. But other than that, all the functionalities, they work the same way. Okay, so everything else here is the same except the pagination you didn't get to see, but if Giselle had more than 12 tickets, then she would also have the pagination. So let's go to the ticket detail page. And this is the ticket that Giselle made the comment on. So let's say that we wanted to update this ticket. We can go ahead and update it. I can change that to maybe a bug. I can say it's almost done. So let's say 80%, and I can update it. And because I'm an admin, the ticket detail page shows me the user who created the ticket. In this case, that's Giselle, because otherwise I wouldn't be able to know who created this ticket. So because I'm an admin, I need to see who created the ticket so I can see clearly that this is a ticket for Giselle, and this is her information, and this is the ticket detail. And as an admin, I can now assign someone or a representative or tech support to the ticket, and only users that have the tech support role will show up on this drop down list. In this case, I have Harry and Dave. So let's go ahead and assign Dave to this ticket, and you can see the ticket has been assigned to Dave. I can also upload and download files. So if Giselle uploaded the file for me, I can come here and then download it like I just showed you. I can also upload a new file. Let's say that I've been working on this and there's something I need to send to her. So I'm gonna go ahead and upload the file for her. And let's say I want to send this document, for example. So I'm gonna say open. And then you can see the new file has been updated, and Giselle will get an email because someone else uploaded a file to her ticket. So when she uploaded a file, she didn't get an email, but when someone else does it, she will get an email. So let's go to her email. And let's go back. You can see new files uploaded on the ticket. So if I open this up, and you can see all the details. So it's a, hey, you know, someone uploaded a file on your ticket. Here is the date. Here is some information about the ticket. And here's the file name. In this case, it's only one file. That's the document.pdf file. And she can click on this link as well to go to the ticket detail. So you can see this is the same ticket. So let's go back. And I can also reply to a comment. So I can go here and then say, yes, of course, please let me verify the patch was sent to your system. I'm just making things up, and I'm gonna post this comment. And when I do that, she will get another email notifying her that a new comment was added to her ticket. So let's go to her email again, and let's go back, and you can see new comment on ticket, the same ticket number. I can open that up and I can see information about the ticket and the new comment. Yes, of course, please let me verify the patch was sent. Oh, typo here, was sent to your system. So when she uploaded a file on her ticket, she didn't get an email. When she added a comment on her ticket, she didn't get an email. But if someone else does it, then she will get an email or a notification telling her that someone else uploaded a file or added a comment to this specific ticket, which is why we provide the ticket information so that she knows which ticket this is concerning. So let's go back. And also now, because I'm an admin, I can create a new task on her ticket. Remember before, when she logged in, she didn't have access to see this button or to edit or delete this task. But because I'm an admin, I'm able to do that. So if I want to, I can go ahead and create a new task. So I can click here. I can put the name for the task and then pass in a description and then a status. And not only an admin can add a new task, but a tech support can also add a new task. So in this case, Dave and Harry can also add a new task if they were to log in and then access this ticket. So I'm gonna go ahead and search everything and then click on download report. And I'm gonna download this report and then open it up. And you can see this looks more like a normal report. So we have the same information, but this time we have 3 pages. And we have pagination, we have all of the tickets here. So that looks more like a normal report. So let's go ahead and close that. And everything else works the same for the admin as they work for a normal user or everybody else in the application. But I just wanted to show you what the report looks like when there is more tickets. And also I can click on these tickets that I see here, and it will take me to the ticket detail page. So if I click here, it takes me to the ticket detail page. And if I go back, it'll take me back to the report. I also have a new link in the navigation bar where I can see the users of the application, and Giselle didn't have that. I don't know if you noticed. So let's click on it. And here we have all the users that have an account with our app, and we can click on one of them to see more details. So if I click on Dave, for example, I can see Dave's profile, and it's really just look like a profile. The only difference is it says the name of the user here instead of welcome yourself. And I don't have access to change their multi-factor authentication. And also I don't have access to see who logged in on what device. But other than that, everything else is the same. So let's go back to the users page. And if I bring Giselle back, and you can see that she doesn't have that link to go to users. And if she tries to just go there, she gets an access denied because Giselle is not an admin. I just wanted to show you that. So let's go back to the message now. So let's go to messages, and I have 6 unread messages. I have 4 conversations, but 6 unread messages. And I can see the one Giselle just sent me here at the very top. So it's gonna be sorted. The most recent is gonna be at the top. So let's reply to Giselle. Yes, I will get back to you next week. Now say send. Let's go back. Let's reply to Enrique. And you see how this scrolls to the very bottom. So I'll show that one more time. So if I click on Enrique, you see that the chat window scrolled down to the bottom. Now we'll enter a message. And then press send. And when I click send, you see that it also scrolls to the bottom. So some random message again. So if I click send, the window is going to be longer because there's a new message. So it's going to scroll to the bottom again. So if I click send, you see it scrolls to the bottom. And also the number of unread messages has been updating. So now I only have 2. So if I go back and I click to see my conversation with Jerry77. And if you look at the messages, once I click this link, it will be back to 0 because then I will have read all of the messages here. So if I click it, you can see it updated. Now it's 0. So I've read all my messages. Okay, so let's go to my profile, and everything here is also the same, but I'm going to show you what's going to happen if I try to update my settings. So if I try to lock my account, it's going to give me this warning. I can ignore it, of course, or cancel, or I can say, yes, I'm sure. And then now my account has been locked. I can do the same for expired, and I can do the same for disabled. And now my account has been disabled. So I'm gonna go ahead and undo that, because if my account is expired or locked or disabled, then I won't be able to log in. And then everything else is the same. And then I can scroll down. This works the same way, so I can enable or disable multi-factor authentication. But here I can also change my permission and my role. So I can change to a user or tech support, a manager, an admin, or a super admin is what I am right now. So I can change it to admin. And you can see my permissions have updated, and my role also has been updated, and I can change it back to super admin. Okay, now I'm a super admin. The super admin has like all the permissions, and then comes the admin, and then the manager, and then tech support, and then user. So I'm not going to change myself to a user, because then this drop down will be disabled and I won't be able to change it back. But other than that, everything else works the same way. So I think that covers everything for the profile page. There's definitely more features, more subtle features that we will get to see in the course. For example, one that comes to mind is your account will be locked if you try to log in with the wrong password. So I think I set it to like 5 failed attempts. So if you try to log in with a correct email but the wrong password for like 5 times, on the 6th try, if you failed again, then it's gonna lock your account. So there's like little subtle features or functionalities that that I'm not showing here because it would just make the video too long. But you'll get to see everything when we start working in the course, because that's when we're really gonna get into all the little details of everything that we're doing. And the application is also fully responsive. So if I drag the screen here, you can see that it's fully responsive. And if I go to a message, for example, and I make it even smaller, you can see that it's responsive. We have our menu, everything works. Go to the dashboard, everything looks good. I can go to the tickets. You can see all the tickets are here. Go to the ticket detail, everything is here. So it's fully responsive. And even if we had a mobile device, so if I do this and put it on a mobile device, for example, let's do some iPhone here, you can see that it's still fully responsive. So I can go to the dashboard again. You can see everything is looking great. I can go to the let's say messages, for example. You can see I removed the photo because it takes too much space. I only show the name and the messages. And if I go to a message, you can see that it still looks great, and I can still work with it if I'm on a mobile phone. And that is true for all the pages. Let's say if I go to the profile and I'm not showing the devices. So the devices are gone. I only show the header with my information. I can change my profile here. I can actually show you that. It's gonna disappear. Let me scroll up and scroll. As it gets smaller, and you can see that we no longer have the devices. And in this case, you just have to scroll down to see the devices. So all the pages in the application are fully responsive. There's also a lot of technical stuff that I did not touch on in this demo. If my access token is expired, for instance, and I try to send a request, the server will respond with a 401 unauthorized, and the app will send the request to the authorization server and get me a new access token with my refresh token, and then send the original request. And all of this happens so fast, I wouldn't even notice that this has happened. Another example is, let's say if I remove my token. So let's go to application and remove both of my tokens. And let me remove the device view. So now I don't have any tokens. And let's say I try to go to the messages. So if I click on messages, you can see that it says I'm not logged in and I'm redirected to the home page. But then if I go and try to log in again, it logs me back in because I already have a session. Remember, when we log out, you have to say invalidate my session. But the other thing is it takes me back to the page that I was trying to go to before I was redirected to the login page. So you can see now it takes me back to the messages page. So there's a lot more technical stuff from the backend client to the backend server to the database that I don't get into in this demo because this video would be too long, but we'll get to see all of that in the course. So that's everything I'm going to be showing you how to do in this course. And needless to say, we have a lot to do. So let's jump right into it. So what I want to talk about now is the design of the entire system. So you can actually draw a line right here because this is the front end. So that's the Angular application and your browser, and everything that you see on the right here is your backend. So the backend is based on the microservice architecture, specifically the microservice architecture of Spring Boot. So we're going to be using the Spring Boot implementation of the microservice so that we can build everything. So we will be starting with the backend, and the most important piece of the backend is going to be the authorization server. So the authorization server is going to play a key role because it's going to be that server that's going to authenticate all of the requests coming in and out, either through the gateway or the requests going into the microservice. So before, there was an idea in the microservice world where they would say that if you have a very secure network where all of your microservices live, then you don't need to secure the microservices themselves. You can just secure the gateway because we know that this is an internal network. But now it's more like you have to make sure we secure the microservice individually, because then that makes it more secure. You never know where a request might come or whatever the case might be. So now the more accepted way of doing this is to not only authenticate the request coming through the gateway, but also whenever the request gets to the microservice. So in this case, you see that I have the gateway here, which is what the Angular application is communicating with. But the gateway is accessing the authorization server to authenticate the user. So it's asking for the public key of that server. And we're going to talk about encryption a little bit later when we start working on the authorization server. But it needs to get the public key from the authorization server and then verify that the token that's being passed with the request is correct. Once this is verified, then it's going to send the request, say it sends the request to the ticket service to get some ticket or some tickets information. In this case, when the request comes in here, this service will also call the authorization server to validate that the token, or if there is a token, that token is valid, and then process the request and then send the response back to the gateway, which will then send the response back to Angular, and then Angular will process it and then present it to you on your browser as the user. So the flow is going to be like a little bit interesting, and hopefully you guys are ready, because we're going to be doing a lot of work in this app. I will also be using PostgreSQL as my database, and these are managed by Docker. So since we're going to be building this locally, so we're going to be using Docker to generate an instance of PostgreSQL. The same with Kafka and Zookeeper, so that we can have an instance of Kafka, because the notification service is using Kafka for communication between the other two services. So these two services, they're communicating with each other using HTTP. So if I'm in the ticket service, I need user information. I'm not going to re-implement the feature for users because it already exists here. So all of the profile information is coming from this user service, but the ticket service also needs user information. So the ticket service will call the user service to get this information whenever it needs to do some processing for some tickets or something like that. But whenever the ticket service or the user service needs to communicate with the notification service, then they were going to do it through Kafka. And then Kafka will handle the communication between these three services, and then the microservice will be waiting for messages coming through Kafka. And then it will then contact the Gmail API with the user information and then send the email to the user. And I'm going to show you like one flow. Let's say I log in and everything, and then I upload a file, or I post a comment on a specific ticket. So what's going to happen is I'm going to post it, and the browser Angular is going to manage that, send the request to the gateway. The gateway is going to validate that the token is correct, because this is a protected route. Let's say I'm trying to post a comment. So then it will say, okay, this request has a token and the token is valid. And then that request will then go to the ticket service. The ticket service will need the user information for the processing. So it will ask the user service microservice to give it this information from the database, because we don't want to re-implement the user information here. It already exists here, which means that somehow we need to pass in the token from this microservice to this microservice. There's like really easy way to do this, but you need to know how. So then it will call this user service, get the user information, process the comment, post the comment to the database, and then send a message to Kafka so that the notification service can be notified that we dispatching an event, which is a no comment has been added. Then the Kafka will take that message and then the notification service would read that message and then send the email to the user using the Gmail API. So only the notification service has Gmail API information or can send an email. So none of these other microservices can send an email, but they can dispatch an event saying, hey, there's been a new comment, or there's been a new user added or created a new account, or there's been a new file uploaded to this particular ticket. The notification also is responsible for the messaging feature. So all the messaging feature is built on the notification service. That's what it's for. All the ticket related stuff is on the ticket service, and then all the user related stuff is built on the user service. The other piece that I want to touch on is the discovery. So this discovery is what's going to allow these microservices to communicate in a more streamlined way. And it's also going to provide us a dashboard where we can see which services are up and which services are down. And I'm also going to show you how you can secure this dashboard using database users. So I'll show you how you can actually secure that Eureka dashboard that you usually see when you're working with Spring. I've never seen anyone showing you how to secure it. Actually, you have to secure it because you don't want anyone to see your dashboard and your services, which services are up and down, and sensitive information about your dashboard. So hopefully you're familiar with everything here. You know what are microservices, you know what Kafka is, SQL, what are discovery services, and then a gateway and stuff like that. But the biggest beast, I will say, is going to be the authorization server. And we will have some very interesting configuration in these three services, actually in all four of these. So the services and the discovery server and the gateway, because we need to secure them as well. So I'm going to show you all of these configuration. I'm also going to show you how to fully, well, maybe not fully, but greatly customize the authorization server, because we not only have to show our own homepage, we have to manage the two-factor authentication. So we have to build on top of the authorization server provided by Spring the feature of multi-factor authentication, and that takes a lot of customization because you actually have to dig in deep into this configuration and then set this up, and it takes multiple different files. So this course is going to be pretty heavy, so hopefully you guys have some experience and then you're ready to go into the course and learn. But I do encourage people interested in learning all of these technologies to have some very, very, very strong foundation when it comes to microservice with Spring Boot, and have some decent knowledge of Angular. I mean, I don't really think that Angular is really hard to learn. It's even easier now because of the new changes that were brought into Angular recently, but you still have to have some basic knowledge about everything that you see on this page that we're gonna get in when we actually start coding. And we'll be coming back to this so that we know what we're building and where we are. But what we're going to begin with, which is going to be like one of the most complicated part of this application, is going to be the authorization server. So get ready, make sure you get your coffee or whatever drink you like to drink. Make sure you're ready because this is going to be a little bit intense. So hopefully you guys are ready. So let's go ahead and get started. So before we begin, I'm going to show you what I have in terms of development environment. Some of the stuff here you're going to need to have installed, and some of it I'm just going to show you what I have in my environment and what we'll be using in this course. But ultimately it's up to you however you want to set up your development environment. So to begin, we will need to have Java installed because we're going to be building Java applications in the end, and you need to have that Java installed on your computer in order to run these applications. So you need to have Java installed. And then Maven is optional, so you don't need to have Maven installed because we don't really need Maven to build this app. But if you're working with a Java application with a POM file, then Maven is a good tool to have because you might need to run some command. The notification service can communicate with the other two services. If you want, you can go ahead and install it and run it, but I'll show you another way using Docker. So if you don't want to install it, you don't have to. In a couple of minutes, I'm going to show you some Docker files that are prepared for you so that you can use them instead of installing Apache Kafka on your computer. So you can just run a container. And then we'll be using Spring Boot for the entire backend architecture. So the microservice architecture that comes with Spring Boot, that's what we're going to be using. You don't need to install anything there, but I'm just showing you that this is what we're going to be using to build the entire backend. And you will need to have Node.js installed because we will need that to create the front-end application. So make sure you have the latest version of Node.js installed on your computer. And then we'll need the Angular CLI. This is going to help us manage the Angular application in the front end. And if you don't have that CLI, it's going to be very painful to create all these files and all the boilerplate code just by by hand. So having the CLI is going to help us create the files and the boilerplate code so that we don't have to do it manually. And you can also do other things with the CLI, like you can test and deploy your app, but we'll just keep it to creating component and pipes and things like that so that we don't have to do it by hand. And then I'll be using Tailwind for the styling of the front end application. There's nothing to download there, but I'm just letting you know that we'll be using Tailwind so that we can style the front end application. You will also need a terminal. I have a Mac, so I'm just going to be using iTerm 2, but you can use whatever terminal or emulator that you like. And for the database, I'm going to be using PostgreSQL for the database. So you will need to have that installed, or if you don't want to, I will show you how to run a container and then have a version of that running on your machine so that you can connect to it. But for our database, it's going to be PostgreSQL. You can feel free to change that to MySQL or some other database, but that's what we're going to be using in this course. And then I'm going to be using pgadmin to manage the database. So you can install that if you want to use pgadmin. If you want to use a different tool, that's totally fine. Doesn't really matter, but that's what I will be using. And then Docker. Remember, I told you I'll show you how to run Docker and create some of these things so that you don't have to install them. So if you want to have that same setup, then you'll need to have Docker installed on your computer. So now let me show you what I'm gonna give you. So I will be giving you this folder, which is named Docker, and inside of it there are 3 files. So there's 2 Docker Compose files and then 1 environment variable file. So the first Docker Compose is gonna give you an instance of Kafka. So if you have Docker installed on your computer, then you don't have to install Kafka and you don't have to install PostgreSQL. So I'm providing you with these 2 files and the command at the bottom you can run so that you can start those containers and then connect to your Kafka server or your PostgreSQL. So I'll give you these 2 files and you can just take them and then run this command. So for Postgre, I give you the command to run to start the container, and then I give you the command to run if you have PLSQL and you want to connect to it using your terminal. You can do that with this command. And if you want to go inside of the container, then you can do that using this last command at the bottom. So you don't have to install Postgre, you don't have to install pgadmin. If you want to have the same setup that I have, you can just take this file and then run this command, and that will create the instances on your computer using Docker, and then you can just connect to them. So one for Kafka with Zookeeper, and then the other one for PostgreSQL with pgadmin. And the environment file is just a file where you can specify your username, your password, the database name, and an email and a password to connect to pgadmin. So those are these variables that you can see here. So take this folder, and if you have Docker installed, just run these commands that I put at the bottom of these files, and then you should be good to go to connect, and we'll be able to start building the application. And then the last thing I want to show you is I'm also going to give you the HTML and CSS, or Tailwind in this case, for all of the pages of the application. So I have them all here, and this is the dashboard page, so just the HTML, nothing else. And this is the message detail page. Obviously we'll be showing this conditionally, but all the markup is given to. And this is the message list page. This is the profile page, also giving you the loader for the profile. So whenever the page is loading, we'll show this, and then once we get our data, we'll show the actual page. And then we have the registration page, the report page, and the ticket detail page with the loader as well, and the pop-up window to create the task, and also the list of all the tickets with pagination and the loader for the ticket as well. So I'll be giving you all of the files that you need to start building the application. We're not going to do that yet because we're going to start with the backend, but you have to go in the resource of the course and then get all of these files so that you don't have to create them yourself. So I'll give you all these files, and it's really the same thing. So for example, if I come here and I inspect it, so this is really the same code that I was using in the app. So you can see it's responsive the same way I showed you in the demo. So make sure you get those files. And I think that's everything you need to know before we begin. So make sure you get these resources. Make sure you get the Docker Compose file so that you can run the instances of Kafka and PostgreSQL and pgadmin. Or if you want to have your own setup, if you already have a different database or whatever, or something else, then you can feel free to use that, because I know a lot of people in this course, they're experienced developers, so they already know what they have and what they like to work with. But I just wanted to show you what I have in my setup and what we'll be using in this course. So you can take those resources and then run those instances on your computer, or you can use whatever tool that you like that you've been using. So if you have any questions, let me know. If you're having any issues with the files that I gave you, or with Docker, or with anything else, let me know. I can send you some resources that can show you how to install those things on your machine if you want to. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. So I'm in Spring Initializer and I've already completed the form so that we can create our new application. And I just want to show you some of the dependencies that we're going to be using. So the Eureka Discovery Client, we need that so that we can connect to Eureka. The OAuth 2 Authorization Server dependency, Spring Web, because this is going to be a RESTful application. The PostgreSQL driver so that we can connect to the database, and then Lombok so that we can have some annotation and not have to type out all of the boilerplate code. And then I think everything looks good. I'm going to change the version of Java to 21 instead of 17. I think that's what I have installed on my computer. And then for the project, it's going to be Maven. The Spring Boot version is going to be the most recent stable version. So that's 3.4.1. And then this is up to you. You can give this whatever name you want, whatever group or artifact ID you want, but this is what I'm going to have. And then I'm going to click on generate and we're going to create the authorization server. So I'm going to name it authorization server and then save. So that's going to give me a zip file. So I'm going to go ahead and unzip it and then open it in my IDE. So I have the project open and IntelliJ, but feel free to use any IDE that you like. And I want to go to the POM file. So let's close that up. So there is a couple of things that we need to do here. So let me remove this comment and I need to scroll down and we want to go to the Spring Cloud version. So that's 2024.00. So that's the latest stable version of Spring Cloud. We need to have that version here. So that looks good. And we have the authorization server here, the web, Eureka client, remove the space, PostgreSQL, Lombok. So everything that we specified. And we want to check the dependency management. So here you have to put this dependency management for Spring Cloud. And I think that looks good. So it's passing in the version that we specify up here. So 2024.00, it's passing in that version here for Spring Cloud dependencies. Okay, so everything looks good. I don't think I need to do anything here. So, okay, we got our plugins. All right, so it looks good. So I'm gonna go ahead and scroll up and I'm gonna add another dependency right after the Lombok dependency. So I'm gonna go here and then I'm gonna say dependency. This one is gonna be commons lang the version 3, and this is gonna come from orgs that Apache Commons, and I'm just gonna pick the latest version, so 3.15.0, and I'm gonna refresh this. Okay, so this is a very convenient library to use in Java application, and I'm gonna show you what we're gonna be doing with it. And another one that I forgot is the validation. So I can actually move this dependency right below this one, and then I'm gonna add another dependency. So here I want to say dependency, and this one is gonna be Spring Boot starter, not starter, so starter dash validation, and this is coming from Spring Boot. So I'll just select that, and the version is gonna be managed by Spring Boot, so I don't have to specify the version. And we're also gonna need time leaf, so I'll copy that one more time and then paste it, and then I'm gonna change the Spring Boot starter, and then we're gonna say timely. Okay, and I think I will need a JPA, which I forgot to put in here. So right below web, I'm gonna add another dependency here, and I'll just copy this because it's coming from Spring Boot, and copy Spring Boot starter validation, and I'm gonna change validation to Data JPA. And then there's two more dependencies that I need to add. So I'm going to add them at the bottom. So I'm going to scroll down, and right before the test dependency, by the way, you can put these dependencies wherever you like. And I'm going to copy this dependency so that I don't have to type the whole thing, paste it here. And we need to change the group ID to dev.samstevens.totp, and the artifact ID is going to be TOTP. We don't need the scope, but we need the version. So I'm going to change scope to version. And I think the latest version is 1.7.1. So this is what's going to allow us to do the QR code setup so that we can ask them to enter a QR code whenever they have multi-factor authentication enabled. And then the last one is to be able to capture the user agent. So whenever they log in, we need to determine their browser, their operating system, and stuff like that, so that we can save this information in the database and then show them later where they logged in and what device was used and stuff like that. So for this one, we need to have NL that bash.js that parse that user agent, and then I think it's called yet another user agent, something like that. And then the version is going to be 7.29.0. So I think that's the latest version that I saw, and then I'm gonna refresh. Okay, so I think at this point, that's all the dependencies that we're gonna be using. But if we forgot something, then we can come back here and then put it back in here at any given moment. You can also specify a license if you want, a developer as well, if you would like, and then some of the SCM information if you would like. So in my case, I'm just gonna leave them blank because I don't really have a license or whatever. But you can place your name here as the developer and stuff like that with your title, like tech lead or senior software developer and stuff like that. But in my case, I don't really need to put that information in. So that's everything that we will need for this app. Now, if we try to run this application, it will fail because we need to have a lot of things configured because of all these dependencies that we have. So we won't be able to run it yet because it will fail. One last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the application file. So let's open up the resource and go to, well, not the resource. We want to go to the main in Java, and then I'm going to just refactor this and rename. And I just want to call this application like that. So application refactor. Yes. Select everything. Okay, so now if we go in here, it's gonna say application. Okay, so I think we're good in terms of cleaning this up and make sure we have all of our dependencies on a prom file. Now we need to do a lot of configuration so that we can run this app. So we need to connect to the database. Otherwise, JPA is going to give us an error. I think Eureka is also going to give us some error because it's going to be looking for the Eureka server. So we won't be able to run it unless we set up that configuration. So we have a lot to do in terms of configuration, and we're just going to have to do those things first before we can actually run the app. So that's what we're going to be doing next. So let's close these files and let's go to the resource. So in the resource, we have template and static. We will not be using static, so I'll maybe rename it. And I want this to be keys. So we're gonna have public and private keys in here. And I'm gonna create another folder. I'm just gonna call it data. So here we can have data for our SQL or any kind of data that we wanna run on the database whenever the application is starting. And then I'm gonna rename the application properties file to a YAML. So YML refactor, and then I'm gonna copy this file and then click on resources and then do Control V, and I'm gonna say -dev, copy that, and then click OK. So that's gonna give us another YAML file, and I'm gonna do the same thing again, paste it, copy this, and then paste it. We're gonna do another one for test, okay, and then lastly we're gonna do another one for prod. So I'm gonna say prod. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 configuration files. And let's go to the dev one. So this dev one is the one that we're going to be using for our dev environment. So this current environment that I have on my local computer. And then I need to define some stuff. So I'm going to say private_key, and I'm going to name this just private key. So private.key, and I'm going to copy it, paste. I have a typo here. So private key and public key. So public key, going to change that to public. So these are going to be the references for the public key and the private key. And then I will need the Postgre username. That's going to be user in my case, lowercase user. And then we'll need the database. So let's copy all of that. And then we say database. Well, before that, let's do the password first. So paste password. Let me in is going to be mine. And let's remove these spaces. I don't know what I'm gonna name the database yet, so let's say Postgres host. So that's the location of the database instance. In your case, that's probably gonna be localhost, but mine is gonna be running on another computer. So I'm gonna say 192.168.1.209. That's where mine is running. And then we need another one for the port. Port by default is gonna be 5432, and I'm gonna move this at the bottom. And instead of database, I'm just gonna say, yeah, I guess database is fine. I'm gonna name mine local DB. So the local database is gonna be the one that we're gonna be using for the dev environment. And let's define a server_port. That's going to be important because we're going to have multiple services running. So we need to be able to specify which port each service is going to be running on so that we don't have conflicts. And then I'm going to pass in the UI app_URL. So that's the URL of the front end application. That's going to be HTTP://localhost. I'm gonna run the Angular application in 3000, and we want to go to login. I think it's login or maybe code. I don't know what I'm gonna set up yet, but let's just keep it this way for now. And I'm gonna put a space here, and at the very top I'm gonna add another one that's active_profile, and I'm gonna set that to dev. So that's the dev profile. So that's all we're gonna be doing in this file for now. And then I'm gonna copy everything, go to the test, and then paste it, and then go to the prod, paste it, just change the profile to prod, and the profile in here to test. Okay, so now we have different environment variables that we can reference depending on where the application is running. So let's close everything. And then now we need to reference those environment variables in here. So first thing we're gonna do is bring that application, and we want the name. We're gonna call this authorization server. So a lot of times you can see this in uppercase, or you will see they put a dash like that to separate the two words, but I don't like that. So I'm just gonna keep mine as authorization server as one word. But I think the convention is you put a dash in between the two words. I just don't like that. So authorization server, that's going to be the application name. And this is not trivial. This is actually very important, because otherwise you're not going to be able to register with the Eureka client, because the Eureka client needs to give you a specific name whenever you have to register with it. So I'm going to talk more about that, but I'm just saying, just because we're giving the application a name doesn't mean you can just ignore this. It's really important that you pass in this name here. And then under application, I'm going to pass in cloud, and I want to pass in discovery. And then we want to pass in enabled, this value here, and we want to set this to true because we want to register with Eureka. And then I'm gonna go down under application, I'm gonna say profiles, and we want to pass in the active profile. In this case, we're gonna pass in the variable, so $ open and close curly braces. We want to pass in the active profile, or we'll pass in dev as the default. So we can either specify this active profile as an environment variable whenever we're going to run the application, or if we don't, then it's going to use dev as the default. And then I need to pass in the data source so that we can connect to the database. I'm going to pass in the URL, data source URL, so JDBC, and then we want to say PostgreSQL, and then : // and then now we're going to pass in our variables. So here we're going to have Postgre host, and then we're going to have the port, so $ open curly braces, and then Postgre port, and then a / $ open and close curly braces again, and then we need to pass in the database, so Postgre database, and then we're going to pass in the username, pass in the username that we set, so Postgres username, and then we need to pass in the password, $ open and close Postgre password. And then for our connection queries, and this one, test connection query, we can just say select one. And then after that, I'll go under data source and then pass in JPA, and then we need to pass in the database. In this case, we're gonna say PostgreSQL, and then we're gonna say open in view, set that to false. Then the database platform, org, hibernate, dialect, PostgreSQL, enodbd, dialect, generate DDL, we're gonna set that to false, show query, we'll set that to true, and hibernate, DDL auto, set that to update. Then I need to pass in some properties. Hibernate, we're gonna pass in this, need to pass in a dialect, and format SQL, set that to true. So hibernate, copy that, put it here, and we have a typo here. So we might not use these properties, but I'm just gonna put them here anyway. And then after that, I need to define some Eureka stuff. So I'm gonna say Eureka instance, and then IP addresses, I'm gonna set that to true. And then I'm gonna pass in the client, and we need the client service URL. This is going to be default zone, and this is gonna be HTTP : // and we need to pass in a username and a password. So here, I'm gonna pass in user_name. So we have to define these, and then a : $, open and close again, password, and I'm gonna say @ local host. We're going to be running the server on 5002, and we need to go to /Eureka and then slash. Okay, so let me scroll up a little more. So we need to find the username and the password. So let's copy those. I actually forgot to do that. So here, we're going to go maybe down here, username and password. And for the username, I'm going to say maybe admin. For the password, I'm going to say let me in. So we'll talk more about that because obviously we can't leave passwords in the clear like that, but we're just going to keep it for now. So I'm going to copy these two, make sure I make the same change here and also end the test. Close, close. So now we can access the Eureka server using a username and a password. So unless we provide username and a password, we won't be able to access the Eureka client to see the dashboard. So that's what this is. Okay, so again, just bear with me. I'm going to explain everything and it's all going to come together. And I think this is supposed to be PostgreSQL 8. So I'm going to change that to this value. So I wasn't sure and I did a quick lookup. So I'll show you. So I think it's supposed to be this value right here, but we'll see what happens when we try to run it if we get an error, but it should be this value. And again, we might not use this configuration for JPA, but I'll keep them here anyway. So I think that's everything we have to do for this. And we still won't be able to start it yet because we have to set up some more configuration, but we're making progress. And the last thing I'm going to do for this is we're going to go to the application and then down here, we're going to say add enable Eureka server or enable discovery client. Yeah, not Eureka server. So enable discovery client. So we need this configuration so that we can connect to Eureka. So I think that's everything we need in terms of configuration for now. So if we start it, it will not run because we don't have the Eureka server running. We can disable it and we say don't connect, like we can set this to false. But we have so much to do that we can do that a little bit later. Once we get everything set up for the authorization server, then we'll just set up the Eureka server very quickly. And then we will run it and then we'll try to run this app. So there's more important things that we need to do before we can run the application, and we'll be doing those later. So what I'm going to be doing next is to start writing the code that we need to set up the actual authorization server. And to do that, there is some things that we need to understand. So I'm going to give you a brief introduction of what we're going to be doing and the kind of flow that we're going to be using, because you can use different flow with an authorization server, and then we'll start writing the code. So that's what we're going to be doing next. So I'm assuming everyone coming into this course have a pretty good idea of what an authorization server is using OAuth. So I'm not going to go and explain what it is and how it works and stuff like that, because that will take a lot of time, but we'll go over some of the key concepts or some of the important things that you need to understand before we begin. So let's look at some terminology. So the first one is resource owner. That's usually the person, like the end user. It doesn't necessarily have to be the end user, but in most cases it's the end user because we own some resources. Like I have my own tickets, I have my own profile, so I am the resource owner. Like I own the tickets and I own my profile information. It says here, it's typically the end user. So that's typically the person that owns the data. So if we quickly go back to the diagram, so in this case, the resource owner is this lady here. So we didn't have this lady in the diagram, but I wanted to explain this. So I put a person on here so that you can understand a little bit better. So the resource owner, let's say this person is Daphne, for example. Their name is Daphne. So Daphne is the resource owner. Like Daphne owns the ticket information that's saved in the database that the ticket service manages, and she also owns her user information that the user service manages. So she is the resource owner. So let's go back. So the next thing is the client. So the client is the application. In this case, that's going to be the Angular application. So if we go back to the diagram again, this is the client. The Angular application is the client. So resource owner and then the client. So the client is typically the application that the resource owner is interacting with and then asking to get this information. And it's usually what displays the information that the resource owner is asking for. So this person is not going to interact with the microservices because those are microservices and they're returning JSON data. So a regular user is not going to interact with JSON data. So they need a client application. So that's what this Angular app is. It's the client. You can have a Vue application or a React.js application. That would be your client. So if we go back again, the client application requesting access to a protected resource on behalf of the resource owner. Okay, so the Angular application is going to ask for this data whenever this user say, hey, can you fetch me my data? And that's when everything's going to start, because then it's going to need to talk to the authorization server and stuff like that. But we'll see that. So let's go back. And now we have the resource server. So this is typically the application where the data is. So in our case, the microservices are the resource server. That's where the resources live. I mean, the data actually lives in the database, but you know what I mean. Nobody's going to interact with the database unless you're like the database developer or something like that. So it's going to go through this application because that's where all the business logic. I mean, semantics, but I just want to make sure you understand. So the resource server is going to be the microservices because that's where the data is. And then we have the authorization server. That's what's authenticating everything and everybody. So it says here, the authorization server authenticates the resource owner and issues access tokens after getting proper authorization. And then the user agent is the browser. It could be the terminal or any kind of interface that is used by the person or the resource owner to interact with the client. So in our case, it's going to be the browser because we're building a web application, but it could also be some other application even, or a terminal or something like that. So in our diagram, the browser, as you can see I put down here, is what's going to be our user agent. So the browser is the user agent. So the person is the resource owner. So Giselle in the demo was the resource owner. The Angular application is the client, and the resource servers, they are the microservices. So you have to make sure you understand what these terminologies mean, because when we get in the code and we're writing different pieces of logic for different things, then you will understand where every piece fit in the puzzle. All right, so let's keep scrolling. So at the very top, they just touch on some terminologies that they think is important that you should know. But really, they're just gonna answer the questions of what authorization flow should I use. So let's scroll down. They just ask some questions and then they say, if this is true for your case, then this is the flow that you have to use. So in this case, they're asking, is the client the resource owner? So they're asking, is the Angular app also the owner of the resource? In our case, this is no, because the Angular app doesn't own anything. It just interacts with the microservices. So the resource owner is this person over here. So we cannot use client credentials because the client is not the resource owner. And then let's scroll down a little bit more. Is the client a web app executing on a server? So this could work for us because our client is running on a server. Like when we deploy the application, in our case, the Angular application is going to be running on a server. So in this case, we'll have to use the authorization code flow, but let's see what else we have. So is the client absolutely trusted with the user credential? This is no, because the Angular app is running in the browser and we know we cannot securely save credentials in the browser. So that's not going to work for us. So let's scroll down. Is the client a single page application? Yes, that is true for us because the Angular app or a React application is a single page application. So it's a SPA. So in this case, they say we should use the authorization code flow with proof key for code exchange as our flow. So this is what we're going to be using right here, because we have a single page application, which is an application running in the browser using HTML and CSS and JavaScript. And that's the flow that is recommended to use whenever you have that set up. So we will be using refresh token with the authorization code flow with proof key for code exchange. So that's going to be the flow that we're going to be using. And then there's more like for mobile app and some other things, but that's the flow we need. This one for single page application, we need this flow right here. Okay, so that's the flow we'll be using. We'll need to get an authorization code, and whenever we're gonna talk to the server, we need to provide something called a PKCE, which is proof key for code exchange. And I'll show you everything in detail, but it's important that you understand this flow is the one that we need to use. So let's scroll up a little bit. So what does this mean for us? So that means that we need to set up the resource owner. So we need to set up our user. We also need to set up our client, and we'll have the resources a little later, like the services, like the user service and the ticket service. So that's going to be the resource servers. And then we'll have to set up the authorization server. We don't have to worry much about the user agent because we already have a browser. So we will need to tell the authorization server about the resource owner, so the users, and the client. So the client is the Angular application that's going to be requesting information on our behalf. So these two things we have to tell the authorization server about. Otherwise, this will not work, right? The authorization server needs to know who is the resource owner and who is the client. Otherwise, it will not authenticate us and we won't be able to access the resource servers because we didn't get a token from the authorization server. So we need to set up the client and the resource owner, and that's what we're going to be working on next. So let's go ahead and tell the authorization server about our Angular client. So to do that, I'm going to create a package that I'm going to call security. So we begin, and the first class is going to be authorization server config. So this is one of the most important configuration in the entire setup. So let's press enter, and I'm gonna say SLF4J for some logging. I'm gonna set this as a bean, so configuration, and then we're gonna say required args constructor, and let's close this and scroll down. I'm gonna put some more space so I can scroll to the top. Okay, so we're gonna create a bean so that we can tell the authorization server, hey, this is the information that you need to know for our client. And you can have as many clients as you want. In our case, we're gonna have just one because we only have the Angular client. So we're gonna provide this information to the authorization server. So there are multiple ways that you can do this. You can create your own class and then pass in the information there. But as you can already guess, Spring already provide a lot of this information out of the box. So one thing that we're gonna use is the registered client repository. Okay, so we're gonna give this name, and we can pass in JDBC template. Okay, so that's gonna be the template, and I'm gonna explain what this means, and then we're gonna return a new JDBC client repository, and then we pass it the JDBC template. So what this is gonna do, it's gonna initialize some classes that Spring is gonna use to fetch the client information. So you can see this is a client repository. So you can actually go in there. You'll see that it will be writing all of the queries for you so that they can go and get the client and the client information. So you can see all of this information it's passing here to go in your database to get the client for you so that you don't have to write all the queries and stuff like that. So that's the bean that we're creating here. We're saying, hey, you can use the existing class that is provided by Spring. So what this also means is that you have to stick to some convention, like some names you have to respect, some table names, and like some column names you have to respect. As you can see, they're all here. So whenever we're going to create the client and the database, we have to make sure that we pass in this information exactly the way it is. Otherwise, this repository won't know what to query. So then the next question becomes, how do we know what are the columns and stuff like that for the client application? Okay, not the user, just the client Angular application. So you can see them here, but there's an actual SQL file that you can actually use to see that is provided that you can actually see. So if I copy OAuth to registered client and I press shift 3 times and then I try to search that, and then I'm going to put that SQL. Well, actually, I'm going to remove the underscore, and you can see this file comes up, and I'm going to click on it. So this is the table definition for the OAuth to registered client that Spring is using by default. Again, you can create your own class, but since it's already provided, we don't have to write everything from scratch. So now we know everything that we have to provide whenever we want to create a client, and Spring will be smart enough using this configuration for the repository to know how to fetch this data, update it, or save it in a database so that we don't have to write all the queries ourselves. So it's like a JPA repository kind of thing, where you just provide some information and then it gives you an interface that you can interact with so that you can save data in the database or fetch data like find by ID and stuff like that. It's the same idea. So we can copy this schema, and I'm gonna open Visual Studio Code, and then I'm gonna create a new file, and I'm gonna paste it in there, and then I'm gonna say Control S to save it, and I'm gonna name it schema.sql, and then I'm gonna click save. So we know we will have to create this table in a database before we can run the application, because then we'll need to pass in information for the client, and then that's how Spring is going to be able to fetch the data for us, because we will be using the same columns name and everything, so you won't be confused. So we'll get back to this because we need to change it to fit the Postgre database. I think this looks like MySQL, but in any case, as long as we have the same data type for whatever database management system that we're using, it will work just fine. We just have to stick to the name and type of these variables, then everything will work. So let's go back to the application, and I can close this now because I already copied it, and also close this. So now let's pass in the information we want. So let's go here, and I want to create the client whenever the application starts. And we already configured registered client repository in this case, so we can just use this repository. And if you go in there, you'll see that it has the same thing that you're familiar with a JPA repository. So find by ID, find by client ID, and it also has a save. So if you want to save a client, we can just use this repository since we already have the bin defined, and then just say create the registered client and then save it. We can also find it by ID or find it by client ID. That's the convenience that you get with that. Or you could write your own query or using JPA or whatever the case, but it's already provided, so we're just going to use it. So let's close that. So I'm going to create another bin for whenever the application runs. So this is going to be the application runner, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with. So application runner, I'm gonna call it runner, and we can pass in whatever we want. So in this case, we need the registered client repository. So registered client repository. And then now we're going to save the information for our client. So here we're going to say return arguments, open and close. Okay, so we want to say if the client doesn't exist, then we're going to create it. Otherwise, whenever we start the application, it's going to create this client again, and we don't want the client multiple times in our database. So we will put a condition. So we're going to say if the registered client repository that find by client ID, for example, and then we say client. So we're going to give the client ID. And if this is null, then we're going to run this code. Okay, because we don't want to create the client multiple times. So then we're going to define the client. So we're going to say registered client. So that's the Angular application. And of course, Spring is going to give us some very convenient classes and methods that we can use. So we're going to say registered client that with ID. So the ID is going to be a random UUID, and we're going to say to string. So let's see if we can import that. That's coming from Java util. So that's going to be a random UUID that we're going to give. And then we can pass in the client authentication method. So remember, the client authentication method is how we're going to authenticate the client. So how the Angular app is going to authenticate itself. So in this case, we can pass in client authentication method, and then we're going to say none. Because the Angular app doesn't need to authenticate itself with anything. It's the resource owner that will authenticate himself. We know that the Angular application cannot securely save anything because it runs on the browser. So that's why the authentication method is none, because it doesn't need to authenticate. And before that, I'm going to pass in the client ID for the Angular application because we need to give it a client ID. So we'll say client. Oops. So the same name that we just defined. Okay, so that's client ID we just defined here. That's the one we're passing here. So if this is false, it's gonna run and save this client with this client ID, which is client, which is why we're checking to see if it's null. So it's only gonna run if it's not null. And then we're gonna say client secret, and we're gonna pass in some secret. So we're gonna say secret. You see that I'm not really using any environment variable or anything like that, but in your case you should, because you don't want to put client and secret in the open like that in clear text. But that will work for this course. Just make sure that you don't do that in a real production application. So we're saying this is the client ID for our Angular app. This is the secret for the Angular app, which is secret. And then we say the Angular app is not going to authenticate itself, so no authentication, but we need to tell it the authorization grant type. So the grant type is where we're going to pass in the flow. So we're going to say authorization grant types, and they're going to say types. Yeah, this takes a lambda. So we're going to rename these two types. And what we're going to do is we can pass in multiple different types here. So we're going to say types, that add, and we need to pass in the authorization grant type, authorization code. So that's why we're telling it, hey, we need to use the authorization code flow. And then I'm going to do Control D so that I can duplicate this line. And we also need the refresh token. So we're going to say refresh token because that helps make the entire flow a little bit more secure. Okay, so we need authorization code because that's what we saw when we look at the documentation for the different flows, and refresh token. If I go back, if you remember, let's scroll down a little more. So here, so we need the authorization code to make it even more secure. We're gonna need refresh token. This PKCE key or proof of key will come a little later, but we need refresh tokens and we need the authorization code. So let's go back. So that's that, and then we need to define some scopes. So we're gonna say scopes, and we can pass in some scopes in here. So scopes is gonna be add. We need the open ID. So OID scopes, that open ID. And we need the profile, so scopes that add OID scopes that profile, because we want to share the profile information of the user. And we can also pass in the email, so scopes that add OID scope that email. I will explain what this means a little later, because that's going to allow us to expose some information about the resource owner, like their profile and their email information. And then I'm going to pass in a redirect URL or redirect URI. So in this case, I'm going to define a redirect URI as a class member. So I'm going to say add value because I'm going to define it in the configuration. And then I'm going to say $ open and close, and then it's UI.app.url. And then we'll define it as a private string redirect URI. So this is going to come from the configuration in case we want to change it. We're not going to pass it in manually. So that's going to be the redirect URI. And then I'm going to define the post logout URI. So that's going to be where we want to be redirected whenever we logged out. So I'm going to say http://localhost, or you can pass in 127.0.0.1, and we want to go to 8080. because that's where the server is going to be running. And we can pass in some client settings. So we're going to say client settings. So the client settings, you can pass in different types of settings for the client. Like you can require an authorization consent, like the page that you get that says, hey, do you allow this specific application to access your information? So if you wanted to set that, for example, you will say client settings, builder, and then you can say that require authorization consent. So in this case, you would have to set up the authorization consent page and its configuration in your main configuration file. So if you wanted to have that, for example, you would just set that to true. And you can set that to true, but if you don't have the configuration, then it doesn't really matter. And then we can also pass in token settings, which is pretty important. So we're gonna say tokens settings, that builder, and we need the refresh token. So refresh token time to live. So I'm gonna select that and then say duration of days. So you can pass in how many days you want the refresh token to live. So you can pass in 30 days or 90 days or something like that. So in my case, I will pass in 90 days. And of course, this depends on the requirement of your application or how your application is going to be used. And I can also pass in access token time to live or its format. So you can see the different configurations here. So access token time to live, we'll say duration. So whenever we get an access token, how long should it be valid? So we're gonna say minute. You can do days, hours, whatever you like, but to begin with, I'm gonna say maybe days. Let's say 1 day, and then we say build, and then we need to call build, and then lastly we're gonna call the registered client repository that save. So we're able to have access to the save because we create the bean for the registered client repository, and then we can pass in the client that we just defined. So we're gonna say registered client. So that's us telling this authorization server about our client. So we give him the client ID, the client secret, client authorization code, etc., etc. And I'm also gonna grab all of this, put it in a try catch, try, and then catch any exception like that. And then I'm gonna paste it in here. And then if we have an exception, we'll just log it. So log that error exception that get message, just so that we can see what happens if we get an error. So there's a lot more configuration that we can set, obviously, and my hope is that you guys are familiar with this. I don't have to go and explain every single nitty-gritty detail about authorization server, but this simple configuration will work for us. So before I forget, let's go to the configuration and let's define these values. So we're gonna say UI app URL, and then we will pass in the UI app URL that we defined. So UI app URL, this one right here. So it's coming from our configuration depending on which environment we're in. So if we're in dev, prod, or test, so that's where this is coming from. And then we're reading it in the authorization server configuration in here, which is this redirect URL. So the other thing I want to do, you can actually create a separate class for this so that you can create the client or the registered client. What I'm gonna do, I'm actually gonna take it from here because we're gonna have so many different configurations in here. It's not gonna be good to keep it in here. I'm just gonna place it in here and then grab that redirect URI, put it in here. Okay, and a better way is to just create another class and then set this runner so that you can create your client whenever the application starts, but I'll keep it here for now. Okay, so this should run whenever we run the application, and it's going to look in the database when we call find client by ID. And if it says that it's null, which means we don't have this client, then it's going to set up this configuration and then save the client and the database for us. So the other thing we'll have to do for this to work is to run this database query in the database that we have set up. Otherwise, when it's gonna go look for information in this table, it won't find this table. Obviously, this is gonna give us an error. So before we run the application, we'll have to define this table in our database, but we're not there yet. We'll get there. So that's all the configuration we're gonna do for the client. Now we're gonna need to define other configuration for the config server. So more configuration that we need to add for configuring the actual authorization server. You can see we don't have anything for the authorization server in here. We only have a bean for the registered client repository. So we need to add more configuration in here for the authorization server, and that's what we're going to be working on. So let's begin with the main configuration for the server. So I'm going to define another bin, and I'm also going to give it an order of 1 because I'm going to have more than one of the same configuration. And we want to say public. That's going to be security filter chain. And I want to call this authorization server config. And this will take the HTTP security, HTTP. We can also pass in the registered client repository, and that throws an exception. So this is where we're going to define the primary configuration for the authorization server. So the first thing I'm going to do, it says http.course because I need to pass in some course. So configure, and we're going to say course configure that configuration source, and I'm going to set this to null for now because we don't have the course configuration. This configuration is important, otherwise the Angular application won't be able to communicate with it. And then I'm gonna go and define an authorization config. We can keep it simple, and we need to set this equal to OAuth to authorization server configure, this one down here. And then we're gonna say authorization server, and because we have to customize the way that our token gets generated, we need to say token generator, and then pass in let's pass in null for now because we don't have that. And we need to say client authentication. We will pass in null for now, and then we're gonna say OIDC, and then we're gonna say with default. And then we need to say HTTP and pass in security matchers, and then we need to pass in the configuration that get endpoints matchers. And then we have to say with, this configuration changes all the time, so I'm sure if you're watching this video a little later, it's gonna be different. And then you're gonna say with default, and then we need to pass in some exception handling, which is pretty important. So we're gonna say exceptions and define the lambda. So you can have an access denied page, so you can say access denied page, and then you can pass in, let's say /access denied. And then the other thing is we can pass in the default authentication entry point 4, and here we need to pass in a new URL. I think it's login URL authentication entry point, and now we're gonna set in login as the page for login. And then we're gonna pass in the media type request matchers, and since we're gonna be returning a login page, so that's gonna be HTML, so we can say media type HTML, so media type that HTML, text HTML, and then semicolon, and it will return HTML http.build. So we're getting an error here, and that's because this is supposed to be security matcher, not matchers. So you notice that we're not using the registered client yet. Actually, we can start putting out some of this information. So let's say authentication, and then we're gonna say we need to have the authentication converter. So we're gonna pass in a converter, and this is what we're gonna set to null. And then we can pass in the provider, so provider, so that's for the client, and here we're gonna pass in null. And then I'm gonna close that. So we will be defining the authentication converter for the client and the authentication provider for the client. And when we use the authentication provider, that's when we're going to pass in the client registration, because we need to give it the repository that we defined so that it knows how to get the client information. And I need to fix that. So one other thing we can do is to define this course configuration, because it's not too bad. So we can go down here and we're going to say we need another bin, and it's going to be public, and that's going to be course configuration source, and give it an appropriate name. And we're just gonna say create a course configuration, set it equal to new course configuration, and then we're gonna use that configuration to set allow credentials. I'm gonna set it to true, but it won't matter because we'll be using tokens. Let me scroll up a little more, and then we'll say course configuration that set allowed origin. We can pass in a list of string in here, and then we're gonna pass in course configuration that set allowed headers. We can pass in anything here, array as list, and we can pass in a list in here. And then we can pass in another course configuration for set expose headers. Also, we take an array as list. And then lastly, we need to pass in a loud method, also takes an array. And then we need to pass in a max age, set max age. We're gonna say 3600L, well, that's 2 zeros. And then we need to define the source. This is something I do all the time, so I just know it. URL base configuration source. And then from the source, we need to register this configuration and the root path, and then pass in that course configuration. And then we return the source. Okay, so that's the course configuration. I'm gonna copy it and then paste it instead of this null value. Okay, and let me put in what those values are going to be for these. So I just defined the values for these. I just had them somewhere and I just copy and paste them, and I can scroll over to show you. They're just some headers that I use all the time. So it wouldn't be a good use of your time for me to type all of this out. But that's the course configuration, and hopefully you guys already know what the course configuration is for. It's going to allow applications running on different domains to be able to communicate with each other, because the browsers, they have a security in place where if you're not running on the same domain and the same port, then you can't actually communicate with something on a different. And since we're going to have an Angular application and some backend application that's going to be running on different domain and port, then we have to tell the server to allow these communications to happen. So that's what this course configuration is for. So now we need to define the token generator, and we need to define the authentication converter and the authentication provider for the client. So that's what we're going to be working on next. So let's go ahead and create the token generator. So I'm going to scroll down a little more, and I'm just going to go maybe right below it, and I'm going to say I'm going to create another bin, and then say public, and this is going to return OAuth to token generator, and I'm going to pass in question mark that extends anything of OAuth to token, this one right here. And then we're going to call it token generator. And what we need to do, we need to give some configuration for our private and public key. So I'm going to define a JWT generator and set this to user JWT generator .init, and I'm gonna pass in a new Nimbus JWT encoder, and we need to pass in some configuration here. For now, I'm just gonna set it to null because I don't have the configuration for the JWT source. And then from this JWT generator, I want to set the JWT customizer, and then I'm gonna say customizer. So we don't have those things yet, but we're gonna define them. And then I'm gonna say this OAuth to token generator, pass in the refresh token this time, because we need to also configure that. And I'm gonna say refresh token generator equals a new, I don't have the client refresh token generator, so I'm gonna say null. And then we need to return a new delegating OAuth to token generator. Yeah, that's the one. Pass in the generator and the refresh token generator. Okay, so the reason we have to do this is because we need to customize this. Remember, we need to set up some customization so that we can set up our multi-factor authentication and other things like that. So that's why we have to customize these things. So let's see if we can create this user JWT generator. So in our same security package, so we are here, let's create this class, and we want this class to implement the OAuth to token generator of type JWT. And let's collab. And since we're implementing something, that means we need to override some methods, so, or implement methods in this case, and that's what's going to generate the token. So I'm going to say okay. So I'm going to go inside of this class or interface in this case, and then I'm going to click this link so that I can see existing implementation of this. So you can click on any one of these so that you can see how this is customized or how it's implemented. And we are doing this because we need to configure some things here. As you can see, this is already defined. Like if you go here and click here, you can see there is already predefined configuration that we can use. So here is one for refresh token. So if we click on that, you can see one for refresh token. It's pretty simple. And I think the one that I'm going to use as my base is, let's see if it's this one. It's not this one. Let's go back, and I think it was maybe this one. So if we wanted, we could use an existing implementation. So let me actually close them. So we can use any of the existing implementation here that would work in our case. So I think the one that I'm going to use for my base is going to be the JWT generator. So I'm going to copy that. So let's go in there, and we can pretty much copy everything. So let's scroll to the bottom and just copy everything, and let's close, and we'll come here and then paste it. Okay, so we need to go onto this configuration and see what we need to change for our case. So let's scroll down. So we have the JWT encoder. So this one is gonna stay, but we'll need a constructor so that we can initialize it. So I'm gonna copy this name. As you can see, they also had a constructor. So we'll just change the name to the name of our class. And also we are overriding this. So we're gonna say override, and we can keep this assert here because we cannot accept null for the encoder. So this is fine. And we're getting an error here because we didn't define the init. So you can see I'm calling this class and calling an init. So let's see if we can scroll down, and we're gonna define it at the very bottom. So I'm gonna say public, and it's gonna be static, and it's gonna return the same class. So JWT user JWT generator, and we're gonna say init, and we're gonna pass in the JWT encoder. So JWT encoder, and then what we're going to return is just the constructor. So new user JWT generator, and then pass in the encoder like that. So now if we go back, that should fix the init. Okay, so let's go back. So this is done, and let's scroll back up and see what we need to keep and what we need to change. So this will go away. This problem will go away. It just takes a minute or two sometimes. So we're good here. So let's scroll down. So we're gonna check to see if the token type is null, or, well, actually we can just check to see if it's null. So we're gonna say if it's null, and we can just say or, and the access token equals the token type. So if the token type is not null and this access token equals this, we're gonna keep that, and we can check for ID token for the token type. And I think we can remove this string and replace it with OIDC parameters, that ID tokens, so that we can get rid of the string. Okay, so if this condition is true, this is just checking to make sure that the token type is correct. And it also has another condition here. So if the access token is the token type and checking to see if it's self-contained, then it's also going to return null. Okay, so it's not going to do anything. You can break this into two conditions if you like. Compounding the two conditions works just fine. And then we're going to define the issuer as null. Okay, that's fine. And if the authorization server context is not null, we're going to define the issuer by getting it from the authorization server context. That's also fine. I'm gonna remove this space. We're getting the register client from the context. That's also fine. Define the time. So we're gonna get an instance of now. Define the algorithm. 256 is fine. Define another time for expired. And we're gonna do the same thing again because I don't wanna see this string here. So OIDC parameters that ID token. So if this is true, then they're gonna set the time and check to make sure the algorithm is not null. Then they will set the algorithm. Otherwise, they will get the time and then add it to this expires at. So okay, all of this is fine. We need this to happen. Also gonna remove the space here. So builder. Okay, this is a builder. If he has no text, then we're gonna set this. Okay, that's fine. We just need to set the issuer if it doesn't already exist. So that's what this is. Don't add the space. And the builder subject, get principal, get name. Okay, so it's doing some stuff here to set the subject. So we will need to override this because in our case, we need to determine what the subject is going to be depending on the type of authentication. The reason we need to do that is because if we authenticate with the client successfully, then we need to determine, was it an OAuth to authorization request or was it a username password authentication token? So we will need to update this to set the subject. So this principal is returning the authentication. So as you can see here, anything that extends the authentication. So what we can do, we need to go to our package and create a new package, and I'm gonna call it maybe utils, and then I'm gonna create a class. I'm gonna name it user utils, and in here I'm gonna create another method, say public. It's gonna return, let's say static. It's gonna return a user that we do not have, and then I'm gonna say get user, and this is gonna take the authentication because that's what we're getting from the context. So authentication, and here we just need to check what kind of authentication that we have. So we're gonna say if we have the authentication is if it's an instance of the OR, let's say OR2 authorization code requests authentication token. So whenever we successfully log in, but with the code, when we pass in the code, so that's why we need to do that. So we'll say the username, password, authentication token, because that's the authentication that we will have, and then we'll cast it username, password, authentication token, and then we'll say authentication that get principal. So we know that's what's going to be the principal. In this case, it's going to be a username, password, authentication token, because that's what we're using. And then after that, we need to still cast it to a user. So we're going to say return, and then we're going to cast it to our user, which we don't have yet. And then we're going to say username, password, authentication token that get principal. Otherwise, we're going to return the casting of this authentication that get principal. Okay, so let's see if we can create our user now. So let's copy that. Let's create another package. I'm gonna call it model, and then create this class for user like that. And now we can import it. Okay, so now we can use this method to get an instance of the user. So let's grab this and go back to our configuration. So here we're gonna say user utils. I'm gonna import, and then we're gonna call get user, and then we're gonna pass in the context that get principal. Okay, and we're gonna remove this part, and we need to say, well, actually we need to set the subject on this. So let's go here, and we will be using the user ID or a UUID. So we're gonna say private string user UUID, and then we're gonna use getter and setter, and then all args constructor, and also no args constructor. Okay, so that should give us the UUID that we can access now. So here we can say once we get the user, we can get the UUID, and then we'll close that. And I think we can go over. So that's for the subject. I'm actually gonna copy this and then go back. I think I deleted too much because I'm lost now. Okay, so it's setting the audience, so we can replace everything here right here. So for the subject, we pass in this. There we go. So for the subject, we need to pass in the UUID of the logged in user. So that's why we define this helper method. It's going to check to see what kind of authorization we have. So if it's this authentication token code, then we need to first cast it to an authentication, a user password authentication token, and then cast it again to get the principal to give us the user. If it's not, then we know it's already a username password token authentication. Then we just cast it by our user, just calling the principal again. So we just need to know if it's this authorization or authentication, we have to cast it first to username password authentication token and then cast it to a user. Otherwise, we'll just cast it to a user direct. So that's why we need to do this, okay? Because we'll have two types of authentication, and you'll get to see that a little later. It's all gonna make sense. Just bear with me and then follow along, and everything else can stay. So for the audience, we will pass in the client ID, issue at, they're gonna pass in this time, expires at, they're gonna pass in the time, and then the ID is gonna be random. So all of this is fine. And let's scroll to the left. So we have some session information being defined, so that's fine. They're gonna check if it's an access token. They're gonna say it set the not before, that's total fine. Check the context for the scope, set some claim for the scope, so that's also fine. And they have the ID token here again. We're gonna override that with this, copy that, and we will paste it instead of the string, if that's the type, the ID token, and they're gonna set some claim here. We will leave this in place. So there's another way you can replace this as well. So we're gonna say ID token, I think names that AZP. There we go. We get rid of the strings. So this will stay. If it's authorization code, this concerns us. So if it's an authorization code, then they're gonna get the request, get this nonce parameter, so this stays. And then if this has a value, then they're gonna set this text. I think we can do the same for this text with the ID token claims and pass in nonce. Okay, so this is fine. I'm gonna remove that space, set some session from the context, and check to see if it's null. If that's the case, they're gonna set some claim. Okay, so that's total fine. We can replace that with this. Control Z with this, and then we're gonna say off time and scroll down. So if it's refresh token, then they're gonna get the current ID token, check if he has this claim. If it does, then they're gonna get it, and then set it here on this claim builder. That's totally fine. Remove that space. I'm gonna copy this again, replace it here, off time, and we'll replace it here as well. Okay, so that works. You can also replace it here. Do they have the SID? Nope, they don't have the SID, so we can make this a constant if we want, but all of this is fine. Now we get to the builder for the DWS header. So they're gonna check to see if the customizer is not null. Then they're doing some crazy casting here on the encoder. Okay, so I'm just checking to make sure that this looks fine for us. So I don't think they need to do all of this casting, so I'll just remove them. That's crazy that they're doing all of that. So let's remove that. And I see we're getting errors, so I will put these on new lines just so I can see what's going on. So context get client. Okay, so that's fine, and I think we have too many of these actually. And then we have the principal. Yeah, that's the problem. So we get the principal, the context. Okay, getting the context, the token type, get the get the token type, and then the authorization grant type, and then that's that. Okay, so we simplify this. I don't think they need to do all this casting, so it should be fine. And then they check to see if the authorization is not null. Then they will set the authorization on the context for this builder thing, so that's fine. And let's remove the space. Check again to see if the grant type is not null. Okay, set on the they're gonna set that on the context again. That's also fine. We're gonna replace this again. OID params name or parameter names, and then we need that ID token, and they are doing something with the session here. Okay, that's all fine. We want that, and let's remove this space. So this is fine. So the context for the builder, and then they set the customizer. Okay, so that's also fine, and also remove the space here. So they're defining some headers. Okay, that all looks fine, and then they return the JWT. Else they will return null because we have an if statement at the very top. Okay, so that's all fine. I guess we just needed to do some cleanup and then change the way that they're setting the subject, because we need to override this. Otherwise, because we're going to have two types of successful login. So if you log in successfully and you have MFA enabled, that's not the end of the login process. So that's why we have to make sure that we customize depending on the login that has been successful. So if the one with the code is successful, we first need to cast it and then recast it again. Otherwise, we'll just cast the principal, because we know it will be of this type, because that's going to be the user will be returning in both cases. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense, and whenever we start using this, then it's gonna make more sense. And we did all of that just so we could override the way that they're setting up the principal. Otherwise, this is gonna give you an error. So the principal is gonna come up as the authorization code sometimes, because that's the successful login. It's important that we went in there and then make sure that we're setting the principal properly. In this case, we're passing the UUID of the user as the principal. So that's all look good. And we have one more problem here. So that's because we need to set this customizer, because we have to create this customizer, but we'll do that. We'll do that later, but everything else should be fine. And you can customize this even further. So you're technically taking control of how this JWT is generated. And I'm leaving everything pretty much the same, except that I'm telling it how to set the subject. So everything else should be good. I had to double check it one more time. That was kind of boring, but that's part of the work, right? So we look good now. I think we are done in this class, and we just need to use it at this point. So let's go ahead and do some cleanup here that I'm seeing that I can do. Okay, so that looks good, and I need some space here. Okay, so we should be good to go. So now we shouldn't have any errors for this user JWT generator anymore, but we need to provide the JWK source and also the customizer. So the customizer is easier, so we're gonna be working on the customizer next. So let's continue with the customizer, and remember what we're trying to do. We're trying to define the token generator that's going to generate the token for us. In this case, that's going to be the OAuth2 token generator type, and in our case, it's going to be anything that extends OAuth2 token. And one of the things that extends the OAuth2 token is the JWT. So if I click here, you can see JWT is right here, and that's the one that we need to generate for the process that we want to have, or the setup that we want to have. We need a JWT token. So that's why we're customizing this. Okay, so that's what this is. So even though it looks like it's a lot, it's really very simple, and we're defining this token generator right here. So actually I can actually place it in there. So instead of null, we'll say this is the token generator. So we're telling the configuration how to generate the JWT for us. So to do that, we need to give it this configuration, and in this case we need to override the generate method that's going to return the JWT, and that's coming from this interface, OAuth2 token generator. And this is a generic interface, but generic for everything that extends the OAuth2 token. In this case we are looking for JWT, so that's why we're passing in JWT in. So for the constructor, we need to give it a JWT encoder, and the encoder, as you can see here, it needs the key source. And I'm going to show you that configuration, right? So that's what this init is doing. It's just passing in this JWT encoder. And if you go in here and you open this up and go here, you'll see that we need to give it some key set. So you can see it's happening here. So we need to do all that, and it's not going to be super hard. It's going to be pretty easy, but I just want to give you a quick rundown of where we are. So let's define this customizer now. So we're going to scroll down and then create another bean for the customizer. And then I'm going to say public. That's going to be OAuth2 token customizer. And that's going to be of type JWT encoding context. And we're going to say customizer. And what this is going to do, it's just going to return some simple things. So we need to say return, and we know we will get the context. And then from here, actually, we don't need this. We can just say context, open and close, like that, semicolon. Okay, so what we can do, we can check to see if it's an access token, because this code is going to run whenever we have a successful log. But we only want to do something if the access token is present as the token type in the context, because that's when we need to set our claims. So to do that, we're going to say if the access token, so access underscore token equals, well, we need to import that first. Scroll up a little more, import, and this is supposed to come from OAuth2 token type, which is just a simple string. Okay, well, it's not a string, it's the type, but this type is really just access token and refresh token. So we just need to check to see if it's an access token in the context. So we're gonna say equal, and then we're gonna say context that get token type. So token type. So if it equals the access token, then that's when we're going to execute our logic. So here we're going to see in the context get the claim. So get claims. It's going to give us all the claims, and then we can actually add more claims. So we're going to say claims, and you can see that takes a map. So we're going to see we want to say claims that put, because it's a map. So we're going to say put, and we want to put authorities actually. And then we want to say get authorities, and we'll pass the context. Okay, so that's it. So the customizer, we just need to check. So in the context, you have a lot of information. This context that we're getting here, there's a lot of information that you can access, and we just need to set one more claims on the token whenever the token is going to be generated. That's why we're passing it here as the JWT customizer. So we need to customize the JWT even more, because we need to set the claims. So that's what this is doing. So now we can define get authorities. So it's going to be private, and it's going to return string, and it takes the context, and all we have to do is to say return, and from the context we need to get the principal. So that's going to give us our user, and then we need to get the authorities, and then we need to say stream, and we need to map them to granted authority, get authority, and then we're gonna just collect them. We need to say joining, and we're gonna join them by a comma. So that's all we're doing. So from the context, we get the principal. That's gonna give us all the authorities on the principal. We're gonna stream, because we need to map. We're gonna map them to a granted authority, get the authority, because that's going to give us the actual string. Okay, so that's just a fancy lambda here, or a method reference, and then we collect them to a list of strings that is separated by a comma. So that's what we're going to have as a string, user read, and then a comma, user update, and then a comma, ccat read. Okay, so we haven't set that up yet, but that's what this is going to give us. These strings that you see that I showed in the demo, and then in the front end we just split it by the comma here using JavaScript, and then we can show all of this information. And then we can color code it because we have create, read, and update and delete. So we can say if the string includes read, give it the color blue. If the strings include the word delete, then give it the color red or something like that. So it's all going to come together. This is very hard to explain because it's so complex in so many ways. So you just have to follow through, and then you'll see it in the end and like, okay, so how is this piece connected to this? And then you'll see how it's making sense. But it's very hard to explain. Like, I try to find the best way to explain all of that, and it's just, you really just have to jump in and start swimming with the sharks. There's no easy way to explain this because it's such a complex configuration. So I put this at the bottom because it's a simple private method, but that's all we're doing. We're grabbing all of the authorities, we're just mapping them to their string value, and then collect them and separate them as we collect them as a string because this is returning a string, and then we join them with a comma. Okay, so let's scroll up. Now this customizer is in place. So we're almost done with the token generator. Now we just need to pass in the keys information. Remember, this is using encryption. So we need to give it keys so that it can generate the token and encrypt them. So that's what we need to provide here. We need to provide something called a JWK source, which is really a pair of keys, which is going to be a public key and a private key. And why do we need two keys? Because we're using public key encryption, where the public key is going to be public and the private key is going to be private. And I will give you more information about that once we start working on the keys, but you need to understand some basic encryption terminologies. And I'll go over that like very briefly before we start creating the keys. So that's what we're going to be working on next. So just a quick overview of encryption when it comes to symmetric and asymmetric type of encryption. And this is a very complicated topic. Like, you can take a whole class for a whole semester just on encryption and you wouldn't even cover half of it. So that's how complex this can get. And what that also means is that I don't have time to explain the whole thing from beginning until the end. It's just so much to learn. But I will give you a quick introduction. So there is something called symmetric key encryption or private key cryptography. When you have this set up, it means that we have one key, which is a private key, and you share that key with the person that you want to communicate with. Let's say I live in New York and I want to communicate with someone in LA. So I would create a private key. The private key is really just a very long string of characters. It's just the key that we're going to use to scramble our message when we exchange messages over the internet, because the internet is a public domain. So I would go in my room in New York, and then I would go on my computer and generate this very long complex key that only I know. And then I'll take that key and then get on the plane from New York all the way to Los Angeles, and then see my friend, and then secretly give my friend this private key because we don't want anybody to know what that private key is. And then I'll fly back to New York. So now I have my private key and my friend also has a copy of the private key. And then now whenever we need to exchange messages on the internet, we can just encode or encrypt the messages that we're exchanging using the private key that only the two of us know. So this is private key encryption. I mean, I'm simplifying it. It's more complicated than that, but that's the basic idea. The private key is private. Nobody else knows it except the person or the people you want to communicate with. Only them will know that private key. In our case, we have our friend in Los Angeles and they have a copy of that key, and we had to travel from New York to Los Angeles to give him that key because we can't put it in the mail. Anybody can open, well, it's a federal crime if you open a mail in the United States. But hypothetically speaking, someone can look at that key if you put it in the mail or if you put it on a plane or send it on the train or something. So you want to make sure that you go in person and give them that key so that you know for sure no one else has seen this key. You can already see how this is very inconvenient because we have the internet, and the point of the internet is for people to be able to communicate over the world, wherever they are. And I'm not going to travel to Australia to get a key from some person or some institution or some website because I want to access their website, right? That's just not practical. It's very inconvenient. That's why we have asymmetric key encryption or public key cryptography. In public key cryptography, if I want to communicate with my friend now who lives in Los Angeles, I'm going to generate two keys. I'm going to generate a public key and a private. And then I'm going to send the public key over the internet or in the mail or wherever to my friend in Los Angeles, because that key is a public key. Anybody can see it. So if we have some hacker somewhere, they can intercept the message and they can look at the public key. That's totally fine. But I'm the only one who have the private key. So if I have the private key, only I can decrypt the messages that were encrypted with the public. So when I send that public key over the internet and I send it to my friend, in Los Angeles, my friend will take his very secret message that we're exchanging, we don't want people to know, and then he would encrypt it with the public, and then he will send it to me over the internet. Now, even if a hacker has the public key and intercepts the message, they won't be able to decrypt it because only the private key that only I have can decrypt the message that was encrypted with the public key that my friend used in Los Angeles. So that's the main difference between asymmetric encryption or public key cryptography and symmetric encryption or private key cryptography. So in our case, with the OAuth 2 authorization server that we're setting up, we're using asymmetric encryption or public key cryptography, which means we need to get two keys, a public key and a private key. And we will send the public key to the other services that we will have. So in this case, that's going to be the ticket service, the user service, and the notification service. They will need that public key, so we can freely give them the public key, but only the authorization server has the private key. So whenever the services use the public key to encrypt the communication and send it over the internet or send it to the Spring Boot application or send it to another service, it's fine if an attacker or a hacker intercepts the message and try to see what the message is. They won't be able to do that because only the authorization server has the private key to decrypt the message that was encrypted with the public. And then it gets a little bit more complicated because then if you send something over the internet, it can also be intercepted by a hacker and then they can create their own public key. So you might think that, you're connecting to Google and you're logging into your account and you access Google to get a public key, but someone in the middle intercepts the message and then they generate their own public key. So that's when you have the idea of certificates, because we need to make sure that when we request the public key, it's actually coming from the website that we request the public key for. So it gets even more complicated when you start adding digital signatures into the mix. But that's the basic idea. And I'm going to leave you guys with this resource. So if you go on Google and you search how certificates actually work, and I have this beta to prod YouTube channel here, and it gives a pretty good breakdown of public key and private key and how they work and stuff like that. So I'm going to leave you with this resource. You just go on Google, just Google search it. You should be able to find it. Or you can just go on YouTube and then search it on YouTube. It should come right up. But that's what it's showing in this diagram. And I'm going to move back a little so I can explain. I think right about here is a good screenshot. So you can see Netflix has a public key and a private key. So you want to use Netflix and you want to encode your messages. So you would ask Netflix for the public key. So Netflix will give you the public. Then you take your message and then you encrypt your message with Netflix's public, and then you send the message to Netflix. Netflix has the private key, so Netflix can decode the message using the private key, and that's the way that the asymmetric encryption would work. But you can see there's a problem here because anybody can intercept the request that's being sent here and then send you their own public key with their private key so that they can keep decrypting your messages. So you would think that you're talking to Netflix, but you're talking to an attacker. So that's what this is, right? So when you ask Netflix for their public key, that public key is going to go over the internet. It can be intercepted by this bad guy, and he would create its own version of a public key and a private key, and then he will keep intercepting your messages and then decrypt them, and you would never know that because you think you're talking to Netflix. But this right here is the setup that you need to understand. Public key and private key, asymmetric encryption. The public key is public. Anybody can see it, encrypt their messages. So you can watch this video. It's less than 10 minutes. That will explain everything. So in our case, we're using asymmetric encryption or public key cryptography. So we need to generate a set of keys that the server can give to the other services. So that's going to be the public key. And then we're going to keep the private key for ourselves because we need that private key to decode the message. And that's what we need to configure right now in the application because we need to be able to generate those keys. So that's what we're going to be doing next. So back in the application, I'm going to open the file explorer here, and then I'm going to create another. Actually, I'm going to create it inside of the security package, and we need a key util. I'm going to say key util and SLF4J for some loggings, and this is going to be a component because we need to inject it in other classes. So what we need to do is to define the private key. So actually let's define the static final string. That's going to be RSA. So that's going to be our algorithm RSA, and then we need to define the profile. So string profile or active profile, because we need to know which profile is active. So I'm going to come here and just say at value, and then we need to pass in the active profile. So active, actually we name it Spring profiles that active. Well, we didn't name that. This is coming from. So this is going to give us the active profile whenever the application runs. So that's coming from the configuration. So, well, that's the class that the configuration is mapped to. But if we go here, so we're accessing this Spring profiles. So whatever that at the time when we run the application. So that's going to give us the active profile, because if it's the dev profile, we're going to generate some local keys, and then we use those keys to generate the token. If the profile is not the dev profile, then they need to give us some other type of keys that are more secure. So this configuration is only going to run if we have the dev profile or the test profile. In production, we cannot use those keys because they live on the server. So they need to come from somewhere else. And then we're going to say, actually, I can just copy this and then paste it here. We need to set the private key. So this is going to be private key. And then we need to set the public key. And I'm going to put more space so I can scroll down. And we have to define those as well. So let's go here. Well, not here. We need to go to the config, and then here we can go down and then say keys, and then private. So that's going to be the private key, and then public. So that's going to be the public key. And remember, we have those defined as variables. So here we're going to say private key, and then we're going to do the public key. Okay. So depending on which profile we have active, we will have different keys. So let's go to the dev. So in the dev, these are going to be the private key and the public key that I'm actually going to set up in the I think I'm going to put them in a folder here, and I'm going to name keys. That's going to be for local setup or test setup. But in production, we cannot do that. So let's go to the prod just to make sure that we keep that in mind. I'm going to remove these two strings, okay? Because in production, we need real keys that are coming from somewhere else, either some secret manager or some vault or something like that. So let's close these. So now we have access to the keys, private, and then keys. And so let's see back here, I'm gonna close that too because I don't need it. So here I'm gonna say keys private, and then here we're gonna say keys public. So now we have the private key and the public key injected into this, and then I'm gonna create a getter. So I'm gonna say this is gonna be public, and it's gonna return RSA key and get RSA key pair, because it's gonna return a key pair. And then we're gonna say return generate RSA key pair, which is a method we're gonna define. Then we're gonna pass in the private key and the public. Now we can generate this method, okay, and it's private, and I'm gonna say private key name and public key name, because those are the names that are coming from the configuration. Then I'm gonna scroll up. So this is where we're gonna generate the public key and the private key depending on what we have in terms of the active profile. So we're gonna say key pair, key pair, and that's gonna be a key pair. Let me scroll up some more, put some more space. Okay, so key pair. Then we're gonna define some keys directories or directory, because it's only one. And then we're gonna say path. So you can see this is local because I'm accessing the path actually, and then get. So what I want to do is to see if I can find the directory where the keys are located. If I can't find it, then I'll just create it on the fly. So it's gonna be in the source, main, and then resource or resources. So resources, and then we created a folder named keys. So we're gonna say keys, okay? And then we can check to see if this exists or not. So we're gonna say maybe verify keys directory, and then we pass in the key directory. If this path doesn't exist, which is this path right here, keys, where the keys are gonna be stored locally. Remember, I already explained this is only local. Then we'll pass in these keys here, or we will create this. So let's go here and then create this method, and it's gonna be really simple. So all we have to do is to say if files that exist, and then pass in the keys directory. And actually we have to check to see if it doesn't exist. So we're gonna put an exclamation mark at the very beginning. So if it doesn't exist, we'll just create it. So we're gonna say maybe, because this can throw an exception, so try, we're gonna say files that create directories, and then pass in the keys directory. So we'll create the directory if it doesn't exist. And then here we're gonna catch any exception. If that's the case, then we're gonna throw the exception. Actually, we can log the error as well, exception that get message, and then we will just throw an exception, a new API exception that get missed. So we don't have this API exception yet, but we'll create it in a minute. But if this is successful, then we will say log that info, and then we're gonna say created keys directory, just so that we can see it, and then key start. Okay, so this API exception, we can take care of it in the very end. So let's just leave it for now. So let's scroll back up a little. So we're going to verify the directory, and then we're going to say if the files that exist, pass in the key directory, and then we're going to say resolve, and then pass in the public key. So we're going to say public key, and we're going to do the same for the private key. Well, we need to put this outside and copy the whole thing. Actually, we should probably do the private key first. Private key. So we're checking to see if the private key and the public key exist. So if that's the case, then we're going to execute some code. So I'm going to say log.info, and we're going to say keys or RSA keys already exist. Loading keys from file paths. And then we can pass in the path, public key, private key, and we need the closing right. So if the keys exist, so when we check to make sure that we have the private key and the public key and they exist, then we're going to say the keys already exist. We're just going to load them from their location. So we're going to say var private key file equals key directories or key directories, and we're going to say resolve because we need to get the actual key, private key, and then we're going to convert it to a file. So we're going to say to file. So that's going to give us a file, and then we're going to do the same for the public key. So public key file equals key directories, resolve, pass in the public key, and then we're going to say to file. So now we have two files and we can work with them. So I'm going to open a try catch block. Okay. And then we're going to say we need a key factory, which we're going to set to key factory that get instance, and then we're going to pass in the RSA. So get instance to take the algorithm. So we pass in RSA, and then we need to get the bytes from those files. So we're going to say byte array. That's going to be public key bytes. So that equals to files that read all bytes, and then we're going to pass in the public key that to path. So that's going to give us the bytes, and then we need the encoded key spec, and we're going to say public key spec equals a new x509. Yeah, that's the one, encoded public key spec, and then we're going to pass in the bytes. And then after we do that, we can then generate the RSA public key. So we're going to generate the first public key, and we're going to say public key, just public key equal, and then we're going to cast it to a RSA public key, and then we're going to say key factory that get public, not get public, generate public, and then we're going to pass in the spec for the public key. So that's going to give us the RSA public key. Then we're going to do the same thing for the private key. So I'll copy everything and then paste. So this is going to be removed because we already have that. So I'm going to change this to private key bytes and then change this to the private key file. So we're getting the bytes from the private key, and instead of encoded key spec, we will use PKC encoded key spec for the private key, and then we're gonna say private key spec. We're gonna set that equal to the same thing, and then pass in the private key bytes instead, like that. And then we'll have the RSA private key. Need to import that, and that's the private key, and then generate private key, pass in the specs, and we need to change this to private key, like that, and that's going to give us the private. So we load the files from the directory if they exist. As you can see, we're doing here, we transform them into actual Java files. So we call the two files on the path, and then from those files we get the byte, and then from those bytes we get some spec, and then from the spec you get the public key and the private. I think I can just move these two lines and the triangle block as well. Okay, so just like that. So make sure this looks formatted. Okay, so that's all we have to do. And another thing we need is a key ID, because whenever we're going to generate the key pair, we need to give it a key ID. So I'm going to say var key ID equal, this can be a string. So I'm going to say UUID that random that to string. So that's going to be the ID for the key, which means that every time the application runs, if the key already exists, then this key ID is going to be different. That's going to be a problem later because the key ID has to be the same, because whenever the other services are requesting the key, they have to give this key ID. So if they request the key and I'm in the public key and the server sends the public key to them, this key is also associated with the key ID. So if we stop the server and run it again, but we didn't stop the services and we try to send a request or something, it's going to fail because the key ID is going to be different. So whenever the services request for that key ID for the public key, then it will be a different. So I'm going to log this, that info, and then I'm going to say key ID and then pass in the key ID in here, because once I run the application once, then I'll remove this and then pass in the key ID as a string so that the key ID can be the same every time. And then after that, we're gonna say return a new RSA key pair. Oops, not this. RSA key, RSA key. I guess I'll have to type the whole thing. So RSA key that builder. And I think this is coming from the wrong place. Yeah, it's supposed to come from Nimbus and builder. Okay, and we need to pass in the public key, that private key, and then we need the key ID, and then build. You can see you can get the 2 keys if you want, but we're gonna return the whole thing because later we're gonna get the either the private key or the public key. But now we're just gonna call build and return these keys. So we probably have an issue here with the, let's see, with the import. So they're coming from 2 different places. So let's scroll up, and the key pair, it's not supposed to come from here. This one, it's supposed to come from Nimbus, this second one. Okay, now it looks good. So I think I can just remove this part at this point. There we go. And let me see. Okay, so the imports are clean. All right, so it's not coming from Java, it's coming from Nimbus. So let's scroll up this one, right? com.nimbus.hostay.jw. Okay, so this is going to generate the key pair if we're running local. So then the next thing we're going to do, so you see the if here. Well, let's take care of this exception first. So if we get an exception, we're going to say log.error, and then we're going to say exception.getMessage, and then we're going to say throw a new API exception, which we don't have, and then we're going to pass in the exception.getMessage. Okay, we'll be creating that in a minute. So if you look at the if statement at the top here, it ends here. So we're going to say else. So if we don't have these files provided, right? We don't have these 2 files, then we're going to do something else. First, we need to check to see where we are. So we're going to say if the active profile that equals ignore case, and then we're going to say prod. So if it's prod, then we cannot use these files. So in this case, we'll just throw another exception. So I'm going to copy this, paste it here, and then I'm going to say public and private keys don't exist in prod environment, because we cannot do this for prod, right? They need to pass in some values for prod, because we need to then get these values from these keys or these strings that we're setting. They're coming from here. So that's why we're checking to see if they exist. So if this file exists, then we can generate the keys. But if these files don't exist and then we are in the production environment, then that's a problem, because in production environment we cannot use this. So I guess we can also say this condition should also not be true. So we can go here and we can put it in the front. We can say end. So if this is not true, so if it's not prod and the file exists, then we're gonna do all of this. Otherwise, if it's prod, then we're gonna throw this exception. And any other case, which means outside of this else, because remember, once we throw an exception, the code will stop. So in case we do have some files that were passed, so we have some private key and some public key that were passed, or some strings that were passed, but then they're not in the local environment, then we can generate the keys again. So I'm going to scroll up and we can do something simple. Let's add a log info. We're going to say generating new public and private key or keys, like that. So this is in the case where this doesn't exist. So if this don't exist, then we have to generate them like from scratch. If they already exist and we can see the files are here, then we'll use them. If they don't already exist, then we're going to generate them from scratch. So the first condition is if the file exists, which means inside of these keys, we already have 2 files. So if we already have 2 files, we don't have to generate them. But if we don't, then we're going to generate them. And if it's the prod environment, then we'll throw an exception. So that's what this is. So in case it's not prod environment and the keys don't exist, or I mean, actually, I can actually remove this because we're checking here again for this if condition. Either way, if the if condition is false up here, then we'll jump to the else, and if this is true, then it will throw the exception. So we don't need to put it up here again. So I'll remove it. So now, because we don't have the keys, so we have to generate them from scratch. So in this case, whenever we run the application the first time, see, we have no keys here. So we need to generate them. Now, after we generate them and they exist in this folder and we run the application again, then it's not going to regenerate them. It's going to execute this block of code. So that's what this is. So let's close that. So in case we don't have those keys at all, then we can generate them on the fly. So we're going to say var key pair generator, set this equal to key pair generator, and then get instance again. This is going to be the same RSA, and then we can say key pair generator that initialize, because we need to start from scratch. That's going to be the size of the key, and then we're going to say key pair generator that generate key pair. So that's going to give us two keys, and there's other ways you can do this. And we're going to define the RSA private key, private key, set this equal to, we're going to cast it RSA private key pair that get private. So it's simple. And then we're going to say RSA public key, we're going to cast it to RSA public key pair, and then get public. Now we generate the two keys from scratch, and we can do try with resource. So we're going to say try var file output stream, and then we're going to say new file output stream keys directory that resolve passed in the public key, and then we're going to say to file. So I'm just showing you different ways that you can do this. And then here we're going to say x509 for the private key, so key spec equal new, and then key pair that public get encoded, and then we need to write it. So file output stream that write, we need to get the encoded. Okay, and then we can do the same thing for the private key. So copy that, paste it, and in this case we're gonna pass in the private key name, and we remember we use a different class for this, so that's gonna be this class for the private key, and get private. Okay, and then we're gonna write. So I'm gonna grab all of this, put it in the try catch, try, and then catch. Any exception, we'll do the same thing again, copy that and place it here. And then lastly, we have to return a new, well, it's the same thing, so I'll just copy it from above this line right here and then paste it. And in this case, the key ID, we don't need to know it because it will be new keys that we're generating. So we can just grab the random and then paste it here. So we generate a random key on the, so when we created the first time, we don't need to see what the key ID is, but here we do need to know what the key ID is so that we can make sure that we use the same key ID every time, because we're loading existing keys or existing files as keys that we already have. Here we're creating them fresh from start. And I think I have too many of these. So try, I'm missing one here. There we go. Okay, so now we just have to define this API exception so that we can get rid of all these errors. So I'm gonna go here and I'm gonna create another package exception, press enter, then create another class API exception, and it's gonna extend runtime exception. We're gonna define one constructor, so public API exception takes a message. Then we're just gonna call super. Actually, we can do this on one line. Pass in the message. That's all we have to do, and then we can import it. Import, take care of everything. So let me scroll up. Still seeing some errors. I got a typo here, so this is string. There we go. Okay, so everything should be good, and also we need to pass in the key names, so let's scroll and grab them here, paste them here. Okay, so everything looks good. So again, just one quick overview of what we're doing. We're generating key pairs, and we're gonna look inside of this directory. If the directory doesn't exist, we'll create it on the fly, which would mean that the files don't exist. But again, we're checking to see if the file exists. So next time around, if the directory already exists with the file, it will not do anything here because we have a condition to see if it exists or not. So if it already exists, then it's going to check to see if the file exists. Okay, like if we have the actual files. So if the file exists, then it's going to load them. That's why I said key already exists. We're loading them as key pairs. So we will load them if they already exist. If they don't exist and we are in the production environment, we cannot generate these keys in production environment. They have to be provided, like some keys has to be provided to the configuration. So we'll throw an exception. Otherwise, which means if the keys don't exist, then we'll create the keys to begin with. So we'll create them and then we'll save them. You can see I'm saving them here, and then we'll return the key pair. So next time if we run the application again, since we are saving them, then they will be loaded running this block of code. Okay, so that's all we're doing. Of course, there's different ways you can do this. There's different libraries that you can use to generate the RSA key pairs and stuff like that. So there's many different ways to do it, but that's just one way that I'm gonna do. So now we can just call this get RSA key pair, and it will give us the key pair that we need. So the next thing we're gonna be doing is making use of this key utils that we just created so that we can get the key pairs and then give those key pairs to our configuration. So that's what we're gonna be working on next. So I'm gonna go ahead and create another configuration in the security package. I'm gonna name it JWT configuration, and then I'm gonna annotate it with @configuration, and then also all required args constructor, and then here we're gonna define the private final key util. So key util that we just defined. So to generate these tokens, we need an encoder and a decoder. So I'm gonna expose a bean for the decoder. So that's gonna be public. That's gonna be JWT decoder, and we're gonna give it an appropriate name. And this is gonna do, well, I think it throws an exception as well. So throw OC exception, this one right here. And then we're gonna say return Nimbus decoder that with public key, and then we're gonna pass in the key util that get RSA key pair that get public key. Oops, no, not get to public key to RSA public key that build outside that build. Okay, so this is gonna give us a decoder. Remember, we need an encoder and a decoder. So this is the bean for the decoder. For the encoder, which we already have. So if you go back to the configuration, so this is the encoder, but the encoder needs the keys, both of them, both the public and the private. So that's what we're going to return here. So we're going to say we need another bean that's going to be of type JWK source, this one. And this is going to be security context. And then we're going to say JWTK source. And we're going to return, let's say RSA key, and then set that equal to key util, lowercase, that get RSA key pair or key pair. And then we're going to need JWK set, and then set that equal to new. JWTK set RSA key, and then we will return the set. So we can just say use a lambda here, select, and then pass in the set. Okay, so that looks like this, and we need to import this. So let's import coming from Nimbus, and that's it. So we have a decoder bean so that we can decode, and then we are returning this object so that we can give it to the encoder. So let's pass this to the encoder. So we go back to our configuration. So we need to pass this here. So let's inject this configuration. So private final JWT configuration. Okay, so now we have an instance of that configuration, and then we can pass it in here that get the key source, and that's all we have to do. So we still need to define the refresh token generator. So this is all for the access token generator. So the refresh token generator, we need to set it up as well, because right now we're setting this to null, and this is not going to be very complicated. So let's go ahead and work on that next. So I'm going to go ahead and create another class inside of the security package, and I'm going to call it client OAuth 2 refresh token generator. Press enter. This is gonna be a component, and it's gonna be pretty simple. So we need to generate a refresh token. So I'm gonna say private final string key generator, and this is gonna be the refresh token generator. Set this equal to a new. We can use the base64 string key generator that's coming up here, and then we're gonna say base64 from Java util that get URL encoded, and then we'll say without padding. So this is going to give us a generator that we can use to generate this key. And then I'm going to define a no args constructor. And then I want to define, well, first of all, we need to extend something, or in this case, implement something. So we need to implement OAuth2 token generator. In this case, it's going to be OAuth2 refresh token. Now we need to override. So let me remove this and implement method generate. All right, because we need to get the context, and that's how we're gonna get the context injected. So now all we have to do is we can just say, I'm gonna put some more space so I can scroll up so you can see better. So we're gonna say if the type of the token, or in the request or the context in this case, if the token type is not refresh token, then we can't do anything. So we're gonna say if it's not OAuth2 token type, so OAuth2 token type that refresh token equal, and we're gonna say context that get token type. If it's not a refresh token, then I guess I can just copy this or cut it out. Then we will return null. Oops, return null. Else we'll do something else. So we're gonna define instant issue at equal instant that now. So we're defining the time that the token is going to be issued. Expires at, or it's issue at. We're going to add the information that's from the context. So we're going to say context get registered client. Remember, the client has the token settings, and that has the get refresh token time to live. So we're going to add that. So that's when it's going to expire, because remember we set this in the configuration. So if we go to the application right here, token settings, so we need to get this information, time to live for the refresh token. So refresh token time to live, we set it to 90 days. So that's the value that we're accessing. We set it to the, adding that to the time that this is created. And then we can return a new OAuth2 refresh token, pass in the refresh token generator that generate. This is going to generate it for us on the fly, and then pass in the issue at expires at. That's it. Remove the space that I added at the bottom to scroll up. Okay, so that's all we have to do here. So because we have a no args constructor, we can initiate this class, and that's just going to create the bean for us because we set it up as a component. So we can go back to the authorization server configuration, set this equal to new this class. That's all. So we give it everything that it needs to generate the refresh token and the access token. Remember, we're still customizing the token generator. So this one is for the access token, and this is for the refresh token. And then we pass those into the delegating OAuth2 token generator, and it takes all the different types of token generators. So again, there's no easy way to explain all this stuff unless you already have a good foundation of OAuth2 and maybe Spring Security with a decent amount of knowledge about how authorization servers work. And in most configuration, most configurations that are not going in production, or maybe that are not using the refresh token, you will not even see this part, because we don't need to do this if we don't need to use a refresh token. So the more customization you'd make, the more you understand how things work. So now we have a way to generate the refresh token. We give it a refresh token generator. So every time you need to customize something, just know that there's going to be some kind of interface that Spring is going to provide to do that. You're never going to have to do something from scratch, except if it's something like very, very specific to a very specific use case. Even with that, there will be like things that you can use to build upon to do what you want to do. But in our case, we need to generate tokens. So there's going to be refresh token generator or JWT token generator. So in this case, we have a JWT token generator. This is our own class, but we're just overriding the OAuth2 token generator because we need to pass in the subject here. That's the only change that we made. Some other cleanups, but that's the only real change. So just know that there's going to be something that already exists that's being used that you can build upon. So this is the OAuth2 token generator, and this is just the refresh token generator. So now we have our token generator that we're using as the token generator in the configuration for the authorization server. So you see it's all connected. So the configuration is almost complete. We just have to create the authentication converter for the client and then the authentication provider for the client. Once we have these two beans in there, then we'll be done, at least with the first configuration. The second configuration we're going to have for this will configure like some things for routing, but the main configuration for the authorization server will be done once we plug in the authentication converter and the authentication provider. So that's what we're going to be working on next. So let's go ahead and create the converter. So I'm gonna open the File Explorer, create another class, and I'm gonna call this one Client Refresh Token Authentication Converter. Press enter, a mouthful, and I'm gonna say this is a component and we need to implement something called Authentication Converter. Okay, and then we will have to override a method called convert. Okay, need to scroll up a little. All right, so the first thing I'm gonna do is to determine the grant type. So I'm gonna say grant type, set that equal to the request get parameter, and I need to check the grant type. So I need to get it. So all of two parameter names that grant type. So we'll get the grant type from the request, and then after that we need to check what the grant type is. So we're gonna say if the grant type is not equals to, let's say, the authorization grant type, that refresh token, that get value. So if it doesn't equal refresh token, then in this case we have a problem because this is for refresh token only. So we will say we'll return null, like that. And if that's the case, or if that's not the case actually, then we'll do something else. So we can say client ID equal request that get parameter, and then we're gonna get the client ID. So here client ID. So we'll get the client ID. We can check to see if it's not null. So we can say string util coming from Spring that has text. So if the client ID is null, then we'll return null because we can't work with that. Otherwise, we will return a new client refresh token authentication converter, and we just need to give it the client ID. Well, it's client refresh token authentication. So we don't have this class yet, but we're gonna define it right now. So let's copy that, and we need the closing like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and create it. And let's go here, client refresh token authentication, and this is gonna extend. So we're gonna see extend, close this. That's gonna be the OAuth to client authentication token. And of course, you know that we need to implement some method. Well, in this case, is to just create the constructor, and I'll select both of them. So with the client refresh token authentication, which is extending the OAuth to client authentication token, we have the constructor that takes the client ID, and we don't need all these other things. So I'll remove them. And then we have another that just takes the registered client. So this will take the client ID, and then for the authentication method, we're gonna see client authentication method none. Remember, the client doesn't authenticate, it doesn't have any credentials, because we cannot securely put any credentials in the client because it's an Angular application that's going to run in the browser, and it doesn't have any additional parameters. So we'll pass in null for these values. So null and null, put a space here, remove this map, and we're going to do the same for this. So we will grab this and this null and then pass it. So for the client refresh token authentication, we only need the client ID, and we do this to make this convenient. Like, we didn't have to create this class, but because we're already working in here, it just makes it a little bit cleaner and convenient. Okay, so that's what this is. So now we can grab this refresh token authenticator and then go back to the configuration. We're gonna pass in this class. That's it. So that's all we have to do. And then we need to create the authentication provider. So again, actually, let me close some of these tabs. And then I'm going to create the client authentication provider. So client authentication provider. So if you know anything about Spring security, you know this is going to implement the authentication provider. So implement authentication provider, this one right here, and then we need to override the authenticate and the support. So for the support, I'm gonna do it real quick. This is gonna be the client refresh token authentication, that class that is assignable to this authentication. So this is the authentication that we support, client refresh token authentication. And hopefully you guys are familiar with support and how Spring Security works, how the authentication manager goes through and then look at all the authentication provider and see which one supports the authentication and stuff like that. These are basics that you have to understand. Then I'm gonna define this as a component so that we can have the bean, and I'm gonna scroll up a little more. Okay, so what we're going to do, remember we have the client repository that we defined in the beginning, so we can inject it in here. So registered client repository. Remember we defined this client repository, and I'm gonna go up here and say all args constructor so that we can inject. And then we need to cast this authentication. So this is gonna be var client refresh token authentication, and then we're gonna cast it to that. So client refresh token authentication, we cast the authentication to this value, and then we need to check that the authentication method is none, because the client authentication method is supposed to be none. So we're gonna say if not, and then we're gonna call the client authentication method that none equal to the client authentication that get client method. So we're comparing the string to the client authentication method. So if this is not none, then that's a problem. We cannot work with that. So I'll copy that and say we're gonna return null. That's a problem because we want our client to have the authentication method of none. Otherwise, we will get the client ID. Remember, with the client ID, we can get the client. So we can say client refresh token authentication that get principal, and we can convert that to a string. So that's gonna give us the client ID because that's their principal. And then we can say client equal or registered client. That's gonna be our repository that get client by ID, or in this case find by ID, and then we're gonna pass in the client ID. So that's gonna give us the client. Well, supposedly. Let's scroll up some more. So registered client. If the client is null, so the registered client is null, then we'll throw an exception. And there's convenient exception that you can use. So you can say throw a new OAuth 2 authentication exception, and this takes an OAuth 2 error. In this error you can pass in a code. Let's go in there so I can show you. So you can see here you can pass in 3 strings. So you can pass in an error code, a description, and a URI if you want. So there's some stuff you can use that's already built in. We'll try to use as much as we. So here we can say, actually we can use the OAuth. I think there's one called OAuth, if I can spell, OAuth 2 errors. Yeah, this one, error codes. And then we can say invalid client. So if you go in there, you'll see that it's got all these messages that you can use that are actually in compliance with OpenID Connect and OAuth 2. So invalid request, unauthorized client, and stuff like that. Obviously, you can change these messages to whatever you like. It's a simple string, but I'm showing you that you can actually use what comes with these libraries already that some team at Spring created. And then here you can say client is not valid. And then for the URI, we can probably get the URI, but I'll pass null. I don't need the URI for this error. And then put a semicolon. And again, you can throw whatever exception you like here. You don't have to use the OAuth 2 error or the OAuth 2 authentication exception, but you might want to use them so that you can stay compliant. The other thing we have to check is the authentication method. So we're gonna say if not, and then we get the registered client that get authentication method that contains, and then we can say the client refresh token authentication that get client authentication method. So if the authentication method is not part of the client authentication method, then again, that's another error. So I'll copy this throw, paste it in here. So let's go here to see if we can find something. So invalid request, access denied, unsupported grid type, token type. So there's nothing for the authentication method. So we'll just keep invalid client, and then we'll say, change this to uppercase C. We'll say authentication method is not valid. Otherwise, if they pass all these tests, then we can return a new client refresh token authentication and then pass in the registered client. So that's all we have to do. So this looks good. I don't think there is much to do here. It's a simple thing. We just need to see or check on some things like the authentication method and the client if it's not null, or the authentication method, because they seem kind of trivial, but they're actually really important because we know what we set. So if our authentication client, or in this case the registered client, has an authentication method that is not none, then this might be a malicious client because we set it to none for our client. And you can check other things. You can see you can access the client information, and then you can check for authentication method and other things if you want to make sure that this is your client. You can even set something custom to make sure that this is really your. So you can do a bunch of things here. So now we have the client authentication provider, which is going to allow us to authenticate the client so that we can say, okay, this is our client. We're going to allow them to request a token and stuff like that. So then we can go here, and then we can say this is then going to be a new this class, and then we can pass in the registered client. So the registered client repository that we passed in here or inject in this, we're finally going to use, just giving it to the authentication provider right here, because it needs to be able to go fetch the client. So the registered. Okay, we can actually grab this and paste it here. So if the authentication method is not none, then that's also an invalid method or authentication method. So it has to be none. So we'll throw an exception as well in this case where it's not none. And now we're just checking to see that they're equals, because they have to be equal. Whatever we have saved in the database and what we're receiving during the authentication, they have to match. So that's what we're doing here. So that looks good. And I think that's gonna be everything for the configuration for the authorization server. And we're gonna have another one of these that's gonna be setting some of the path and what we're gonna set permit all and the multi-factor authentication and other things. But in terms of the configuration for the authorization server, that's everything that we're gonna do here. So the next thing we're gonna do is to define the second configuration or the second security filter chain that's gonna control, what page we're gonna say is open, what page are supposed to be restricted, and things like that. So we're gonna be working on that next. So I'm gonna copy the same configuration, and then I'm gonna paste it, and I'm gonna change the order to 2. So the first one is primary and this one is secondary. And then I'm just gonna name it security filter chain. So this is like the regular filter chain that you're used to. And then I'm gonna remove everything that we did, because this is a different configuration. The only thing I'm leaving is the course configuration, and then we're gonna say HTTP that authorize request matchers, authorize, and then we're gonna set this lambda. So we're gonna say authorize, and we want to do request matchers for the login page because we want to open the login. So the login is gonna be permit all, and then we're gonna do another one for the logout, but this one takes a post request, and then we're gonna see logout. We also gonna see permit all on that, and then I need another one for the MFA. So we're gonna say if anybody goes to MFA, so the multi-factor authentication route that we have yet to define, they need to have the authority of MFA required. And then we're gonna say after that, because remember this is the authorization server, we want to make sure that all other routes are authenticated. So we're gonna say authenticated. So this is just a simple configuration for controlling what you can access in the application and what you cannot, depending on if you're logged in or not. And then I need to define some more configuration for the login page. So I'm gonna say form login. Remember, we will be using form login. So let's call this login, and we want to pass in the login page. So that login page, and we want to set this to login. You can change that if you like, but login should be fine. And then we want to have something called the success handler. So this is really important because this is what's going to determine how we're going to handle the login success. Like when someone logs in successfully, if they're using MFA, then we need to write the logic to do something. If they're not using MFA, then we have to log them in successfully. So we have to define that. So for now, I'm going to say null, but we're not going to leave it at null. We're going to do a lot of work on this. And then I'm going to define a failure handler. So the failure handler is going to be just rerouting the user to the login page. So for this, we can use this simple URL authentication failure handler. And then we just tell it to go to the login page and then question and error. Like you can say error equal, and then you pass in a message, and then you can retrieve that in the browser, but I'm just gonna pass in the error. And then I need to define another one for the logout. So I'm gonna say HTTP logout, and I'm gonna name this logout. and we need to pass in the logout success URL. So if they log out successfully, then we're gonna send them to the front end. So HTTP :/localhost 3000. That's gonna be that. And then I need to add another logout handler for the cookie clearing. So this is going to be the new cookie clearing logout handler, and we need to clear the JSession ID cookie. And hopefully you guys already know what this cookie is, but if you don't, that's just a session ID that Spring will give you to track your session whenever you log in successfully, and the name of it is just JSession ID. I don't know, maybe Java session ID. I'm not sure what the J is for, but that's the name of the cookie that we need to clear whenever someone logs out successfully. So the other thing that we need to do to complete this configuration is to define the success handler. So that's what we're going to be working on next. So I'm going to create a new class, and I'm going to right click. I'm going to say class. I'm just going to name this MFA Authentication Handler. Press enter. And what we're going to do here is we're going to implement the authentication success handler. And because we're implementing something, so that means we need to implement some methods. And I'm going to expand this window just to see what I'm getting. So I think I need the first one. So the request, the response, and then the authentication. I don't need the one with the filter chain. So I'll select the first one and then click OK. And I need to scroll up. So I'm going to put some more space and scroll up. So I need to define some variables here, or some fields. So I'm going to say private final. That's going to be the security context repository. So this one down here, and I'm going to call it security context repository. Set it equal to a new HTTP security context repository. And then I'm going to define another one for the authentication success handler. So authentication success handler, and I'm going to say MFA not enabled, just so that I can really make the difference for you guys. You can pick a different name for this. And then I'm going to set it equal to the save request aware authentication success handler. And I need two more. So I'm going to say private final. This is going to be another authentication success handler. And I'm just going to keep authentication success handler as the name. And then I need another private final string, which is the authority that I need to allow people to access this page. So if you look here in the configuration, you can see that I'm saying if you need to access the MFA page that we're going to define in this application, you need to have this authority, which is MFA required. And you're going to see why I'm doing this in just a moment. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to define a constructor. So I'm going to right click and then say generate, and then I'm going to click constructor, and then I'm going to say okay. But I'm going to change this here because I don't need the success handler to be passed to this constructor. I do need the URL, the success URL, and the authority. So the authority is going to be the role that we're passing in here. So MFA required. And then what I'm going to do in the constructor is I'm going to set these values, right? So I'm going to set the authority. So this is already done by default, but I'm going to remove this. And then I'm going to say simple URL authentication success handler. And then I'm going to name it authentication success handler, and then set it equal to a new simple URL authentication success handler. And then I'm going to pass in the successful URL. And then after that, I'm going to say authentication success handler that set always default target URL. I'm going to set that to true. And then I'm going to say this authentication success handler. So this one that's giving us this error, I'm going to set it equal to the one that we just defined here. So now I'm going to go ahead and then implement this method. So this is the method that's going to be called whenever the authentication is successful. So the only thing we have to do here, we have to say if the authentication is successful, which is when this code is going to execute. Remember, we're calling it on success, right? We're going to pass in this class here. Actually, I can actually do that. So we can say new MFA authentication handler, and then here we need to pass in the route that we want to redirect them to if they're using MFA. So that's MFA, which we haven't defined yet, but we will. And then we need to define the role, which is the MFA required. So we're going to copy that and paste it. So now let's continue working on this. So remember, this method is going to be called when the authentication is successful. It doesn't matter if they're using MFA or not. This will be called. So what we're going to do, we're going to say if the authentication that we get whenever the authentication is successful is an instance of username password authentication token, which is the one that we're looking for. Then in this case, we're gonna see if we can get the user. So we say user, and then we're gonna cast to a user, so the user coming from our model, and then we're gonna say authentication that get print. So now once we get, oops, I have a typo here. So we're gonna set that equal to the user. So in theory, we should get the user. And then we need to check to see if the user is using MFA, because if the user is using MFA, we need to do something else. We need to send them to the MFA route. If they're not using MFA, then we need to say, okay, they have logged in successfully. So we're gonna say if user is using MFA, and we're gonna make sure we negate that statement. So if they're using MFA, which is a simple Boolean, then, well, if they're not using MFA, then we're gonna say MFA not enabled, which is a success handler, and then we're gonna say unauthentication success, and then we pass in the request, response, and then the authentication. So if they're not using MFA, they will be logged in successfully, because that's what this is doing. So if I select this and scroll up, you can see that this is an authentication success handler. It's the save request aware authentication success handler. So that will log them in immediately. That will just tell Spring Security, hey, this is a successful login. Continue with the rest of the logic. And then to make sure that nothing else executes on this method, I'm gonna say return, because it's returning void. So I can just say return so that I can make sure that after this line is execute inside of the if statement, nothing else happens. So that's what's going to happen whenever we have an authentication successful and it's the username password authentication token. But if that's not the case, then we're going to do something else. In this case, I need to save the authentication. So I'm going to say save authentication, which is a method that I'm going to define. And that's going to take the request. It's going to take the response, and it's going to take a new MFA authentication, which I have to define. So MFA authentication, which is going to be just a simple class. And then I'm going to give it the authentication and then the authority. So we're going to save the authentication. And then after that, we're going to call the authentication success handler. So this one that we define here for the simple URL. So remember, we're passing in this URL here, which is the MFA. And then we're gonna say that was a success. And then in this case, we will pass in the same thing, request, response, and then the authentication. So whenever they log in successfully, if they're using MFA, well, when they log in successfully, this handler is gonna be called, right? And when this handler is called, it's gonna call this class, which in turn will call this on authentication success. So what we're doing is we're saying if they logged in successfully and it's a username password authentication token, which is the login of the user, then we're gonna see if the user is using MFA or not. So if they're not using MFA, then we will just say, okay, that was a successful authentication. But if they are using MFA, then we're gonna save the authentication so that we can access it later. And then we're gonna say it is also a successful authentication, but this handler will reroute them to this URL we're passing in here, which is MFA. So it's going to be a successful authentication, but they will be rerouted to this MFA page that we will define, which will ask them to enter the code. Remember, we're going to save the authentication and then send them to this MFA route, which is to some degree a successful authentication, but they need to give us their token so that we can fully verify that they are who they say they are, because they have multi-factor authentication enabled. So that's what we're doing. So now we just need to define the save authentication. So we can do this real quick. So we're gonna say private void, and then we're gonna say save authentication. Remember, that takes the HTTP servlet request. It takes the response, so HTTP servlet response, that's the response, and it takes the MFA authentication, which we don't have yet, so I'll just copy this name, paste it twice, and then make the first letter lowercase. And then what we're going to do is to just save this authentication in the context. So we're going to create a security context for this authentication, because we need to access it later. And this is not coming from Nimbus or Nimbus, it's coming from Jakarta. So security context, that's going to be the security context. So we're creating a context so that we can save that authentication. So we're going to call the security context holder and then create new context, or create empty context. So we create an empty context, and then we call the security context that set authentication. And I'm not seeing set authentication. I think we import the context from the wrong place. So let's try that one more time. So we're going to say context, import, and that, there we go, set authentication. So we need to pass in the authentication, which in this case is this MFA authentication, or we can just name it authentication. So we'll save that as the authentication. And then we're gonna say security context holder that set context, pass in the security context, because we need to access it later. And then we're gonna call the security context repository and then save context. So we're saving the context. So we're gonna pass in the security context for that request and that response. So now let's go ahead and create this MFA authentication. So I'm going to copy the name and then right click on the security package, class MFA authentication. And this is going to extend the anonymous authentication token, and we need to override some class, or at least we need a constructor. I'm going to remove these comments and add a space here. And I'm also going to add a getter. So I'm going to say getter because I need to get some value here, and I'm going to pass in private final authentication. So the regular authentication from Spring Security Core. And in this constructor, I don't need to take all of these parameters. I just need to get the authentication, and I need to get the authority. So string authority, and let me put some more space so I can scroll up. And then when I call the super class, I'm gonna pass in a string for the key. So I'm gonna say anonymous, and we're gonna pass in the principal. Remember, this is a login, but this is not the finished logged in. So we're gonna have to find something to give Spring in terms of who is logged in. And then here we can pass in some role. I'm gonna say, I think there is a create authority list, and then I'm gonna pass it some role. So I'm gonna say role anonymous and pass in the authority. And let me see if I can import this. Import. So all this is doing, it's coming from some Spring util class, the authority util, and it just takes a bunch of strings and it creates a list of granted authority. So that's a convenient method that you can use to just create a list of granted authority from strings. So I'm creating these two authorities and I'm passing them here to this authentication. And then I'm gonna say this, that I'm gonna name this something else. I'm gonna say this is the primary authentication, just so I can make the distinction. And then I'm gonna set it equal to the authentication. And then because I have a getter, I can override the get principal. So I'm gonna say override method, and I'm gonna look for get principal, this one. And then I'm just gonna make this return this, that primary authentication. So that's all we have to do here. I'm gonna remove the space I put at the bottom, and it's a simple class. Remember, this is not gonna have add component or anything like that. It's just well, not a fake, but a temporary authentication that we're creating so that we can ask the user to put their QR code before we can actually fully log them in. So we're creating this fake or temporary authentication. So now we can go back here. Okay, this is already imported, so this is looking good. So again, we get the user that is authenticated. If they're not using MFA, we're gonna say, okay, that's a successful login. We're gonna stop right there. But if they are, we're gonna save the authentication and then reroute them to the /MFA route that's being passed here. Okay, remember, this is the authentication success handler that we're passing in here with this simple authentication success handler with this URL, which is going to be /MFA. So that's why they're going to be rerouted automatically, because that's the handler that we're using for this authentication success. So that's all we have to do for this. And we have a couple more configurations that we're going to put in here, and we should be done after that. So that's what we're going to be working on next. So I'm going to remove the registered client repository because we don't need to inject this in this method. So I'm going to delete it, and then I'm going to scroll down, and then right down here, I'm going to define another bean for the authentication success handler. So even though you have the classes and everything, you have to also define the bean. So I'm going to say authentication success handler, give it an appropriate name, and we're going to just return the return new saved request aware authentication success handler. So we have to define the bean anyway. And then after that, we need to do another bean, and that's gonna be another bean for the authorization server. And this is the authorization settings. So this one right here, authorization settings. So we're not gonna override any of these settings, but we still have to define the bean. So we're gonna say return authorization settings that builder that build. And if you wanted to change any of these things, well, actually, I'll just go in there and then show you. So you want to change the authorization endpoint, and you want to change the device authorization endpoint, and off to device verification, or off to token, like the token endpoints that you see here, like where you have to go to get the token and stuff like that. So if you want to change these default values that we're getting here by calling this builder, then you would just put a dot after builder, and then you would be able to override whatever settings that you want. But I'm gonna keep the default. Most configuration for authorization servers, they will keep the default because that's what everybody knows. They know that if you have the server, then they can go to this specific route to authenticate or to get a token and stuff like that. So we're gonna keep the default. So that's everything that we have to do in this particular configuration. And I know that was a lot, but hopefully you guys are catching up and understanding what's going on here. It's just stuff that you just have to know. You can read books or you can take courses about it. It's just a lot of things that you just don't know until you actually learn it and you know how to do it. And once you do it once or you do it a few times, then you understand it more, and then you can actually dig in and then maybe customize it even more because you understand it even better. But even for me, I had to learn how to do this. Like I have to start from zero and say, hey, okay, how do I configure an authorization server and stuff like that? And also this configuration keeps changing. So today it looks like this. Maybe a few months later, then they might make a decision to remove something. Like I remember there used to be like an apply default configuration for the authorization server. That doesn't exist anymore. The point is this configuration will change, but it will still be doing mostly the same thing. But if you understand it well, then when it changes, it won't cause you any issue because you'll be able to catch up very fast because you really understand what the configuration is doing. So that's all the configuration we're going to put for the authorization server. There's a lot more that we have to do. For example, we need to define the controller, and then we need to define the login page, the multi-factor authentication page. So this page that we're defining here. So we have to define some controller class where we can set these paths so that whenever the user goes to this path, then they're taken to the login page or to the register page. So there is more that we're going to have to do in order to get this thing running. But for now, that's all we're going to do for the configuration. And that's a significant amount of progress because there's not going to be any more configuration after that. There's going to be some, but not as extensive as this configuration. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to go ahead and start working on the controller because we're going to need to define routes that will take us to the login page and the multi-factor authentication page. So that's what we're going to be working on next. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new package, and I'm going to name this controller, and then we're going to create the login controller. So we're going to say login controller. Remember, not a REST controller, not a resource. This is a real regular controller. And I'm also going to create another package for the service because we'll need the user service. So I'm going to say class user service. Actually, this is an interface. Press OK. And we need to define some methods that we're going to be using. So we're going to need one that's going to return a user. We're going to call it get user by email, and that's going to take the email. We need another one that's also going to return void, and I'm going to call it reset login attempts, and this is going to take the user ID or user UUID. I need another void. This is going to be update login attempts. That's going to take the email. And then I'm gonna need another one that's gonna return also void, set last login. For this, I'm gonna take the user ID, and then I need another void for add login device. This is gonna take the user ID. It's gonna take the device name and the client, lowercase, and the IP address. Okay, so now we have the user service. We can use it in the controller. It doesn't have an implementation yet, but we can do that a little later. So that's going to be the service. It's going to be very simple because this is the authorization server. It just needs to get the user, reset their login, and update their login, set their last login, and then log the device that the user logs in successfully with. So this authorization server is not going to be doing things like update the user profile and stuff like that. That's the job of the user server. So that's what we're going to do here. And in the controller, we need to do some stuff in here. First, we need to annotate this as the controller, not REST controller, just a regular controller, because we're going to be serving HTML file. And then all args constructor because we're going to do some dependency injection, and I'm going to put some more space so that I can scroll up some more, and I'm going to leverage some code from the the MFA authentication handler and grab all of these and then go back to the controller and then paste. So we're gonna need the security context repository, so that's gonna stay. We're gonna need an authentication success handler. That's just gonna be an authentication success handler. We're gonna need the user service, so I'm gonna say user service, name that user service. And before that, I'm gonna need another private final. That's gonna be an authentication failure handler, so that we can do something whenever the authentication has failed. Okay, so that's all we need. And I'm gonna set this equal to a new simple URL authentication failure handler. And then in here, I'm gonna pass in /MFA and then a question mark error. So whenever there was a failure, we will redirect them again to the MFA page so that they can try again. And I think that's all we have to do. So we're getting an error for the service because the service doesn't have a bean, so it doesn't have an implementation, but we can do that a little later. All right, so now we're gonna define some routes in the application. So we're gonna define a get mapping that's gonna go to /login. And this is gonna return the login page. So we're gonna say public string login, and it's just gonna return the login page. So we're gonna say return login, and I'm gonna copy this method to create another one. This is gonna be MFA, and it's also gonna go to MFA. So when I go to MFA, we need to return the MFA page that we're gonna create, but we also need to pass in some more information. So we're gonna pass in the model coming from Spring, and we also need the current security context and pass in the security context. So security context, we're gonna name it context because we know we have the user saved in that context. So we can pass in model attribute, and then we can pass in the email and then pass in the email of the user. So we can create another method called get authentication or authenticated user, and then pass in the context that get authentication or get authentication scheme, not scheme, supposed to be authentication. So that's probably because we import this from the wrong place. So this should come from, nope, it's not an interface. It should come from Spring context. So let's see, let's remove the, I want to see where it is. So it's up here. So we're going to remove that and re-import it. Import. So it's supposed to come from the first one, Spring Security Core content. There we go. Either closing. Okay, so now we can define this method, create method, and all we're going to do is to just return. First, we're going to cast it to a user. So our user coming from our model, and then we're going to say authentication that get principal, and we're going to put all of this in parentheses so that we can access the properties on the user. And we need get email, which we don't have defined on the user. So let's see if we can define the email, private string email. So now we can get the email because we need to pass this email so that we can say enter QR code for so and so email. We can also access whatever we want from this. So whatever we have here, we can have the first name, last name. We can also pass that in instead of the email. I'm passing the email, but you can pass in whatever you want. And the reason that I'm doing this is because I want to display the email on the form, the HTML MFA form. I want to say enter QR code for and then the email address of the user. So that's what I'm getting here. Remember, in the context, we saved the authentication, the real one. And then I'm gonna scroll up and copy this one more time. I need another one that's gonna be a post mapping, and we need to import. And that's also gonna go to MFA, but I'm gonna change it to validate QR code or validate code. And we don't need to get the model here, but we will need to get the parameter. So we're gonna say request param. That's gonna be the code, like the QR code that they're gonna pass. That's a string. We're gonna say code, and we need the HTTP servlet request. We need the HTTP servlet response. I'm just injecting those. You can do that anywhere in the application. You can inject the servlet requests and the response. So I'm just injecting them in this controller. Actually, I needed the security context as well. And what I'm going to do in this case, this is not returning anything. So I'm going to say void, and I need to get the user. So I'm going to say user equal get user, and then I'm going to pass in the context that get authentication. And we already created this method, so we can just import it from our util. Remember this method that we created. So we're going to go back and do a semicolon here, and then we just need to check to see if the code is valid. So user service that validate code. No, we didn't add that. So let's go back to the use service. We're gonna create another method which is gonna return a boolean. We're gonna name it verify QR code, it's gonna take the user ID, so string user UUID, and it's gonna take the code. So we need to call this method. So via verify QR code, we have the user that get UUID, and then we have the code. And if this is successful, which means we validate the QR code that they pass us, then we're gonna call the authentication handler, the success one, because that's successful. We're gonna say on authentication success, pass in the request, the response, which is why we injected them, and then we're gonna get the saved authentication. So the one that we saved before, like the real one that we saved before we redirected them to the MFA page. So request response, and let's just create this method. All right, so it's down here, and I think this throws an exception. We'll just add it to the signature of this method. And then the last thing is I'm gonna return, because I don't want anything else to execute in the method. Otherwise, then we know it's a failure. So we're gonna call the authentication failure, and then we're gonna say on authentication failure, give it the request, the response, and then we can pass in a new bad credential exception and valid QR code. Please try again. Okay, so I'm gonna create this method here. Well, I'm gonna finish adding the implementation for it, and then I'll explain again what we're doing here, like how we passing this authentication here, like where all this stuff's coming from. So let me just finish this method real quick, and I'm gonna go back to the let's go back to the handler again, because it's gonna be similar to this. I'm gonna copy that, and I should probably give it a better name. Remove this, remove this. Okay, so what we're going to do, format this properly. So what we need to do is we need to access the authentication that we saved. So to do this again, we're gonna call the security context, but instead of create empty context, we're gonna say get context, because we saved something in there, so we're getting it. And then we're gonna say we need to get the authentication from the context. In this case, that's the MFA authentication. I'm gonna name it MFA authentication, set it equal to, we're gonna MFA authentication cast this, call the security context that get authentication. So that's gonna give us the authentication that we saved, and then this is the authentication that we're gonna pass into the context. And then we're gonna do the same security context set authentication, security context holder set context, call the repository to save the context, but we need to, well, not that, we need to return the primary authentication. So return MFA authentication that get primary authentication. Okay, so what exactly are we doing here? So remember, the user will go to the login page, and they're gonna go here, right? They're gonna hit this, and then they're gonna be presented with a login page that we're gonna define inside of our template, right? So I can actually put the file in there. So we're gonna say login.html, and then we're also gonna have mfa.html. Okay, so these two files. So they're gonna go to the login page, which is this endpoint that's gonna return the login page, right? Because it's just login, which is gonna match this name, so it's gonna render this HTML page. Once they get to this page, we're gonna show them a form that they can submit to post login, right? So the post login is gonna hit this, let's go to the configuration. It's gonna go and hit this, right? The login page is gonna be this, and we're permitting all, so they don't need to be authenticated. So they're gonna go to the login page. And the login page, we're gonna set the form in a way to submit to login when they submit the form with a post request with their username and their password. When that is successful, then they're gonna go here, the success handler. Okay, so that's what this is. So when they log in successfully, when this gets called, then this method is gonna execute this one. So when this method is executing, what are we doing? Well, first of all, we're passing in the URL that we want to route them to, and the authority that they need to have to access this page, the MFA. So we're passing in MFA, which means they will be redirected to MFA if they're using two-factor authentication, and they need to have this authority, MFA required. Okay. All right, so they will go here, and then this method will execute. So you see that we're creating this simple URL authentication success handler here. We're giving it the URL, which is /MFA, and then we're setting this authentication success handler to this authentication success. So the one with the MFA URL, this one. You see, this one is the one that I'm using whenever they're using MFA. So if they're using MFA, this if statement will be skipped. They will go here, which means this is going to be the success handler now, which is the one that's going to reroute them to the MFA. And the authentication that we're setting to the MFA, this authentication that we're creating here, we're giving it this authority, okay, which is the MFA required authority, which we pass it in here to this constructor. It gets passed here. It gets set to this field on the class, which we pass in to this MFA, right, which will pass it into the authority for this super class for the authentication token for anonymous. Okay, so you can see the authority is being passed. So whatever this authentication is going to return it's gonna have this role. We're passing in this other dummy role, but this is the role that we need to look for. MFA required. Okay, so that's what this is. So this authentication is the one that we're saving in this context. Okay, but remember, when we call this constructor the real authentication that we're getting here, so if we go back again, when they log in successfully, see, this is the real authentication. So when they log in success, let's say someone is using MFA and they logged in successfully, this is the real authentication. This has their name, their username, and everything, this one right here. But guess what, we pass it over to this authentication and then we save it in this context. That's the one that we're getting in the controller. This one, that's the one we're getting here. How do we know it's the same one? Because it's the same request. Every request has something called a thread because it's the same thread in the request. Okay, so that's how we know it's the same one. So we're saving it here, but we're creating this dummy one. But when we create this dummy one, we just give it the authority that it needs to access the MFA page. So that's why we're passing in this authority here, which is the MFA required. Because if you just go to the MFA page, like you just go to this page in the controller, it'll give you an error. It'll say, hey, you don't have permission. It'll give you the not having a permission error, which in this case is we're setting up here. See, we're saying you have to have this authority. So even though they're not logged in for real, because we're giving them this fake authentication, but they have the right authority, because that's the only way that they can get to this page. They have to go through the cycle of authenticating at least once successfully before they can get this authority and then be navigated to that page. Because if you just navigate to that page, it'll give you an error. It just won't work. Okay, so that's what we're doing in the controller. So in the controller, when they post with their code, we grab the code, we grab the user from the context. I mean, whatever we're doing here, we're doing it here as well with the annotation. Kind of, sort of. And then we verify the QR code. If the QR code is correct, we say, okay, that's a successful authentication. So the same handler we use whenever they were not using MFA. So the success handler that we're using here, you can see it says authentication success handler. This is the save request aware authentication success. So that's the same one here. So we're just saying, okay, authenticate this person. They're authenticated successfully. And then we're able to grab the authentication because we saved it. So we're just grabbing it. This takes the authentications, takes the request, response, and the authentication. But in this case, we don't have the authentication. We're just verifying a code because the user already logged in, but we saved it. So we're grabbing it from where we saved it. So I should probably call this retrieve because I already have it saved in this class. Remember, we're saving it here. So I'll rename this to retrieve so that it makes more sense. Or get. Okay, so we're getting the authentication that we saved earlier, and we saved it in the context, and this is the same request and the same thread. For every request, Java creates a thread so that all requests are separated from each other. So that's how we know it's the same person, it's the same one, because it's the same thread. I mean, there's a way to hack everything, but generally speaking, that would be the same thread. Okay, so that's how we know it's the same person, because we're still in the same thread, unless they refresh the browser or they close the browser or something like that. But when they send a request through the browser, that creates a thread. So that's what we're doing. And if there is a failure, then we just return a failure. And you do that with the authentication failure, give it the request response, and then pass in your exception. And then Spring will take care of displaying the message, showing the errors and then fire all the events that there was an authentication failure. The same thing happened with this unauthentication success. That's why it's called on, because it's an event. Okay, it's called on authentication success, on authentication failure, because it's an event. It's gonna fire a bunch of other things that are gonna work together, and then your error will be displayed on the error page, and all beans that are supposed to be created for this will be created. So again, you will have to go back to this code and then rewatch those lectures again, and that's just what it's going to take for you to understand this. Then just do that. But that's technically what we're doing. We're temporarily saving the logged in success if they're using MFA, and then later retrieve it whenever we verify the code. Otherwise, we're just gonna say, okay, it's a successful request, they logged in successfully, just fire the unsuccess, and then everything is gonna go from there. So that's what we're doing. So we're getting closer. We still have to fill out the login page, so the HTML and the CSS for the login and the MFA, but we also have to do the service. You can see we're getting an error for the service because the service doesn't have an implementation, and that's what we're gonna be working on next.